A book once existed that was deemed so sacred, it found itself being recited in churches directly next to the Gospels, and yet so perilous that church authorities ultimately prohibited it completely. This text is known as the Apocalypse of Peter. At one time, it stood as holy scripture for innumerable Christians, recited alongside the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as genuine scripture across multiple generations. However, something occurred that concealed this document for more than a millennium. In this exploration, we are going to reveal every aspect of this prohibited scripture and expose precisely why the early church became so frightened of it that they attempted to eliminate it from historical record. But first, before we begin, if this is your first time on this channel, think about tapping that like and subscribe button if you have not done so yet. In addition, share with us your current location and the time where you are. We are creating a worldwide community right here, which means you can connect with people who think like you from every corner of the globe in the comment section below. So, with no more delay, shall we get started? Finding what was lost in the desert? The month is December, the year 1945. Across the Egyptian desert near Nag Hammadi, the arid wind brings whispers. A man named Muhammad Ali Al-Salman searches for fertilizer underneath cliffs made of limestone. Something hard meets his mattock. Ancient clay from long ago. From centuries of sand, the jar rises up. Muhammad Ali pauses for a moment. Stories from the local area tell of jinns imprisoned inside containers, yet poverty gives men courage. His tool swings downward. The jar breaks apart. Into the sunlight tumble 13 books, bound in leather. Pages of papyrus flutter like birds in their final moments. What he can carry, the peasant farmer collects. At the market, these unusual markings could perhaps bring him some coins. The words are beyond his ability to read. He has no way of knowing he possesses pieces of Christianity that had been forgotten. Within these documents rests a vision so frightening that the early fathers of the church shuddered to speak its name. The Apocalypse of Peter. Through dealers in the black market, the books begin their journey. Word of the discovery reaches scholars. Between Cairo and universities across Europe, cables fly back and forth. The world of academia is buzzing with anticipation. Rarely do ancient manuscripts come to light. When they appear, they have the power to rewrite what we know of history. Multiple texts are acquired by Professor Togo Mina. He takes photographs of the pages before they vanish once more into collections held privately. Coptic script is what the images show. Beneath what has been translated lies something even older, Greek source texts from the 2nd century. In the meantime, fragments are emerging from other places. Since 1886, the Ahmim manuscript has been sitting in a museum in France. Scholars had written it off as nothing of importance. They are looking at it again now. A picture starts to take form from the pieces. This specific apocalypse carries Peter's name, the same Peter who 3 times denied Christ, the fisherman who walked upon water before sinking in his doubt. For what reason would anyone place such powerful visions in the hands of this man? In the pages that have been translated, the answer is waiting. Each word brings to light a Christianity vastly different from churches in modern times. In this text, divine justice functions with the precision of a surgeon. For every sin, there exists its perfect punishment. For every act of cruelty, there is found its reflection in eternity. Upon the excavation sites, the Egyptian sun beats down relentlessly. The archaeologists are working with haste. The politics of the local area are becoming unstable. Foreign scholars are facing growing suspicion. For proper study, time is running out. Before translation can even begin, many texts vanish, but enough remains. Enough to expose a doorway that early Christianity decided to seal shut. The Apocalypse of Peter reveals to us what believers at one time accepted as the truth, what they would read out loud in gatherings of the church, what they would whisper about with fearful wonder. Its secrets are given up by the desert with reluctance. At the slightest touch, each fragment of papyrus begins to crumble. With tweezers and magnifying glasses, scholars do their work. Before the ancient fibers turn back into dust, they photograph every single line. Modern Egypt feels distant from ancient Alexandria. These texts, however, create a bridge across that divide. They bring with them voices from house churches, places where Christians would gather in secrecy, where they would debate over which books contained divine authority, where they made decisions about what future generations would come to believe. From this storm of historical dust, the Apocalypse of Peter comes forth, a vision so thorough, so detailed in the way it handles moral accounting, that it nearly became part of the New Testament, nearly transformed into scripture that billions of people would commit to memory. Instead, it disappeared. The graphic descriptions made church leaders grow uncomfortable. More subtle approaches to divine judgment were what they preferred. From memory, the text began to fade. Only fragments remained, buried beneath desert sand, until the mattock of Muhammad Ali changed everything. His search for fertilizer returned forgotten Christianity back into the light. More than simply old books were held inside the jar. It held within it alternative pathways that early believers had considered sacred. With each translation, new horrors are revealed. New understandings emerge about what brought terror to ancient minds. The punishments that are described go beyond what can be imagined. They follow a logic that appears both strange and recognizable. Perfect justice delivered through perfect pain. Scholarly assumptions are shaken by the discovery. Christianity now appears far less unified than was previously believed. For acceptance, multiple gospels were competing. Of the end times, various apocalypses provided different visions about which voices would survive. Church authorities were making choices. These choices gave shape to everything that came after. What modern believers would read was determined by them, what they would think was possible, what they would accept as truth from the divine. The road that was not taken is represented by the Apocalypse of Peter, the Christianity that might have come to be. Questions are opened by its rediscovery that church historians would rather leave alone. Questions concerning authority, canonization, and the forces of politics that shaped doctrine. Across Nag Hammadi, the desert wind continues to blow. The site now receives tourists. They take photographs of limestone cliffs and let their minds wander to ancient secrets. What was discovered here is unknown to most. They have no idea how close this text came to changing the course of everything. Once more, the forbidden door is standing open. Behind it is waiting a vision of judgment so exact, so unforgiving that early Christians both embraced it and feared it. From the sand, the Apocalypse of Peter has made its return. Across the centuries, its message continues to echo, raising the question of why such detailed moral accounting once appeared necessary. Why did believers feel the need to imagine punishment with such specificity? What was it that drove them to catalog sins with the precision of a surgeon? Within the text itself lie the answers. In the strange journey of Peter through realms of perfect justice and terrible consequences, the vision that came to Peter. In a simple way, the vision starts. On the Mount of Olives, Peter is sitting with Jesus. The disciples are gathered nearby, posing questions about the final days. Which signs will announce the coming of final judgment? In what way will the righteous recognize that their time has arrived? With prophecy, Jesus gives his response. Wars will grow in number. Many will be deceived by false teachers. Darkness will overtake the sun, and from the moon, blood will drip. Then arrives the moment that transforms everything. The consciousness of Peter begins to shift. Around him, reality starts to bend. He discovers himself standing in a location between worlds, not entirely of earth nor completely divine. From everywhere and nowhere at once, light pours forth. The air itself appears alive, filled with divine presence. What they see is a struggle for Peter's human eyes to process. Before him extends a vast plain cut by an enormous chasm. On one side of the divide, gardens are blooming in spring that never ends. On gentle breezes, sweet fragrances are drifting. Between trees that are flowering, streams of clear water are winding their way. The dead who are righteous walk, clothed in robes of pure light. With perfect peace, their faces are glowing. But across the divide, Peter's gaze is being pulled. There, within a realm of shadow and flame, He is witnessing something that will leave its mark on Christian imagination for centuries to come. With terrifying precision, the punishment of the wicked is unfolding. Correction tailored to their earthly crimes is what each sinner is receiving. By their tongues, liars are hanging over pits of boiling metal. Fire that never fully consumes is filling the mouths of those who gave false witness. The flames bring eternal agony without offering the mercy of destruction. In pools of molten gold, greedy merchants who cheated, using false weights and measures, are standing immersed. The metal they chased during their lives is now surrounding them entirely. For the surface they reach, but rising is impossible. In endless cycles of futile grasping, their hands melt and then reform. By their hair, women who adorned themselves to seduce the husbands of other women are hanging over abysses of flame. The cosmetics they once applied out of vanity are now burning their faces for eternity. Beauty becomes horror. Into repulsion, attraction is transformed. Men who engaged in forbidden relations discover themselves driven together in embraces that degrade. To separate is impossible. To find satisfaction is impossible. Their prison is created from their desires. What in secret they pursued now defines their state for eternity. Punishments that exceed the ability to describe are suffered by those who brought harm to children. The innocence they corrupted is mirrored in their torments. Multiplied beyond human comprehension, the pain they inflicted comes back to them. Perfect balance is ensured by divine justice. Death is experienced repeatedly by murderers. From great heights they fall, every bone shattering is felt, then immediately they reform only to fall once more. Full awareness of their victims' final moments is brought by each impact. Their endless torment becomes empathy. In growing horror, Peter is watching. The precision is what astounds him. In punishment, every crime finds its perfect echo. With mathematical certainty, divine accounting is operating. No detail goes unnoticed. No sin is left without being addressed. Yet, alongside judgment, the vision contains mercy. In meadows of eternal summer, children who died before reaching moral awareness are playing. Across the divide, their laughter rings out, a reminder that even in realms of perfect justice, innocence finds protection. Between the punishments, angels are moving, not to bring comfort but to ensure accuracy. Against the sin that earned it, they measure each torment. To match moral weight, they adjust the intensity. No emotion shows on their faces, only dedication to divine precision. Their counterparts' suffering are noticed by the righteous dead, but pity they do not feel. Proper emotional response to divine justice is included in their sanctification. That mercy without accountability undermines moral order is something they understand. In the terrible symmetry, they see beauty. Different categories of sinners are separated by rivers of fire. At temperatures suited to specific crimes, each stream is burning. In cooler flames are those who stole from widows and orphans, compared to those who corrupted entire communities with false teaching. The heat never destroys, but always instructs. Not arbitrary cruelty, but educational consequence is what Peter realizes he is witnessing. What the sinner failed to learn in life is taught by each punishment. Curriculum is what pain becomes. Into understanding, suffering is transformed. Though too late for change does understanding come. The vision undergoes a shift. How eternal destinies are created by earthly actions is what Peter sees. Channels that determine final destinations are carved by every choice. Constantly free will is operating, but beyond reversal its effects accumulate. What souls have become is simply revealed by the moment of death. Through regions where different types of wickedness receive correction, angels are guiding Peter. The geography of judgment is what he observes, how, according to moral categories, divine justice organizes itself, how, with artistic precision, punishment fits crime. The tour moves forward through areas set aside for religious hypocrites. In elaborate tortures that expose their hidden contradictions are found those who taught virtue while they practiced vice. Their public faces are melting away. The corruption beneath is being revealed. Inescapable is truth. Particularly creative corrections are faced by false prophets who led believers down the wrong path. The despair their lies produced in others is what they experience. The confusion, the lost faith, the spiritual damage multiplied across all their victims is what they feel. Their agony becomes their influence. But the rewards awaiting faithful souls are also seen by Peter. Gardens where with patriarchs and prophets the righteous are walking. Tables spread with foods that nourish yet never cause satiation. Conversations that continue for eternity without their subjects becoming exhausted. Peter's human comprehension is overwhelmed by the vision. To process the scope of divine justice is something he struggles with. The complete accounting of every moral choice, the perfect balance between crime and consequence, the terrible beauty of a universe where nothing escapes notice. As the vision begins to fade, on earthly ground Peter finds himself once again. But burned into his memory the images remain. The detailed map of eternity's moral geography, the proof that infinitely every action matters. The revelation that with unimaginable precision, divine justice operates. To share what he has seen is what this vision will drive him to do, to warn others about the accounting that is waiting, to describe with unflinching accuracy the punishments and rewards, even with the knowledge that such vivid moral imagery will disturb as much as it instructs. Understanding the Apocalypse of Peter. To a strange family of ancient texts, the Apocalypse of Peter belongs. The future through divine visions is what they claim to reveal. But boundaries that other texts approach carefully are pushed by this particular apocalypse. Where in symbols Revelation speaks, graphic details are provided by Peter's vision. Where at punishment other apocalypses hint, this text supplies blueprints. Familiar patterns are followed by the book. Divine revelation is received by a chosen figure. What they have seen is shared by that figure. On humanity's final destiny, the revelation focuses. But from convention, Peter's apocalypse diverges in its brutal specificity. Symbolic language is used by most apocalyptic literature. Empires are represented by beasts. Hidden meanings are carried by numbers. Interpretation is required by images. Direct description is preferred by the Apocalypse of Peter. By their tongues, sinners are hanging. Over greedy merchants, gold is melting. For the vain, rope becomes hair. From canonical revelation, this literalism sets it apart. In mythic proportions, John's vision unfolds. Cosmic battles are dominated by dragons and horsemen. On multiple levels, the imagery operates. Various interpretations are allowed. No such flexibility is permitted by Peter's vision. In the 2nd century, the text likely originated. Which books deserved authority was still being decided by early Christians. Among believers, multiple Gospels were circulating. Apostolic authorship was claimed by various letters. For acceptance as divine revelation, different apocalypses were competing. In this competition, weight is carried by Peter's name. Among the 12 disciples, he stood closest to Jesus. Any text bearing his signature could be validated by his authority. But that the historical Peter wrote this apocalypse is doubted by scholars. Later composition is suggested by the Greek style. Christian concerns about moral accountability were understood by whoever wrote it. About divine justice, early believers worried. How the righteous would be sorted from the wicked by God was their question. What standards would be applied? How punishment would fit crime? Detailed answers are provided by the Apocalypse of Peter. As moral instruction disguised as prophetic vision, the text operates. About forbidden behavior, specific lessons are taught by each punishment. Not just what to avoid, but why avoidance matters is learned by readers. Too terrible to risk appear the consequences. The text's popularity among early Christians is explained by this educational function. During services, it was read aloud by church leaders. Its descriptions of divine justice were memorized by believers. Teaching about moral behavior was reinforced by the vivid imagery. Curriculum became fear, but problematic was also made by the same vividness that made it useful. As more sophisticated theology was developed by Christianity, inappropriate seemed the crude literalism. More subtle treatment was deserved by divine justice. Rather than enhance religious understanding, the graphic descriptions appeared to diminish it. Questions about divine mercy are also raised by the Apocalypse of Peter. forever. The punishments described seem to continue. No possibility of redemption makes an appearance. Once judgment falls, permanent become consequences. With developing ideas about divine forgiveness, this conflicts. More carefully, later Christian thought would balance justice with mercy. Real might be hell, but for repentance, heaven's doors stayed open. Human failure could be overcome by divine love. No such comfort is offered by the Apocalypse of Peter. By strict moral accounting, its universe operates. Before doctrine became standardized, how early Christians imagined the afterlife is revealed by the text. For specific sins, literal punishments were expected by them. Earthly legal systems would be mirrored by divine justice, was their belief. Directly into eternal consequences, moral categories would translate, was their assumption. Important functions were served by this primitive theology. For behavior, clear guidelines were provided. That injustice would ultimately be corrected was assured to believers. That by appropriate rewards, suffering would be balanced was promised. To human minds, divine governance was made comprehensible. But as Christianity matured, problematic became such simple formulations. More complex understanding of human nature was developed by theologians. That sin involved more than external behavior was recognized by them. As more important than rule following, they saw spiritual transformation. Christianity in its adolescent phase is represented by the Apocalypse of Peter, confident enough to make bold claims about divine truth, not yet sophisticated enough to question the implications of those claims. Believers grappling with fundamental questions about moral order are shown to us by the text. Among works that try to map the invisible world, its genre places it. What lies beyond human experience, these texts attempt to describe. Through divine revelation, they claim authority. Questions that philosophy cannot resolve, they promise to answer. Psychological needs that pure reason cannot satisfy are served by the apocalyptic imagination. That ultimately, moral choices matter is what people want to know. That eventually, justice will prevail is the assurance they need. Of how divine governance operates, they seek detailed explanations. With unprecedented detail, this hunger is fed by the Apocalypse of Peter. Of moral consequence, it provides complete maps. With scientific precision, it describes divine justice. That perfect response is received by every action is what it promises. To anxious minds, such comprehensive answers prove irresistible. Yet what attracts also repels. The same completeness. Human capacity for cruelty is exceeded by the punishments described. Arbitrary and culturally specific seem the moral categories. Mechanical rather than personal appears the divine justice. Intellectual curiosity is satisfied by the vision, while spiritual sensibilities are troubled. The text's complex reception history is explained by this tension. Its moral clarity was embraced by early Christians while its theological implications were questioned. Its instructional power was valued by church leaders while worry arose about its crude materialism. Useful functions were served by the Apocalypse, while uncomfortable questions were created. As monument to early Christian moral imagination, the Apocalypse of Peter stands. Believers trying to understand divine justice without adequate theological vocabulary are shown to us. The hunger for detailed knowledge about ultimate reality is revealed. How vividly unseen worlds can be pictured by religious minds is demonstrated. But the limitations of purely descriptive approaches to spiritual truth are also shown. Detailed explanation is resisted by some mysteries. Human categories are transcended by some realities. Faith, rather than knowledge, is required by some questions. Territories that might be better left unexplored are attempted to be mapped by the Apocalypse of Peter. The Shadow Canon, a parallel scripture. No official reading list was possessed by early Christianity. Which books counted as scripture was not decided by any central authority. To establish canonical boundaries, no committee met. Instead, across scattered communities, hundreds of texts competed for acceptance. Evolution, more than legislation, was resembled by the process. Different books were read by churches in Rome than by churches in Alexandria. Certain Gospels were preferred by Syrian Christians while other options were favored by their Egyptian counterparts. Its own collection of authoritative texts was developed by each community. Later would unity come, from above imposed rather than from below growing. In this chaotic environment, the Apocalypse of Peter thrived. As genuine apostolic writing, it was considered by many early Christians. Alongside Gospels and letters that eventually would form the New Testament, it was placed more highly than texts we now consider canonical. It was valued by some communities. Books accepted by Roman Christians are listed by the Muratorian fragment, dating from around 200 CE. The Apocalypse of Peter is included, but that some believers refused to have it read in church is noted. Even early support came accompanied by reservations. Sensitive consciences were troubled by the text's graphic content. With such vivid material, practical problems were faced by church leaders. To mixed congregations, how do you read descriptions of eternal torment, divine justice, that seems to exceed divine mercy? How do you explain? While preaching terrifying punishments, how do you maintain pastoral care? More pressing, these concerns grew as social respectability was gained by Christianity. New challenges were brought by Constantine's conversion. To educated Romans, accustomed to philosophical sophistication, the faith needed to appeal. For imperial religion, crude literalism about divine vengeance seemed inappropriate. Meanwhile, more palatable alternatives were offered by other texts. Mystical depths without graphic violence were provided by the Gospel of John. Theological complexity while maintaining pastoral sensitivity were explored by Paul's letters. Judgment with hope for restoration were balanced by the canonical revelation, but passionate defenders were retained by the Apocalypse of Peter. By Clement of Alexandria, one of early Christianity's greatest scholars, as authentic scripture, it was quoted. Between its moral intensity and Christian theology, no conflict was seen by him. His confidence in the text's authority was shared by many believers. Deeper tensions within developing Christianity are revealed by the debate. On punishment or restoration, should divine justice focus? Frighten or encourage? Should apocalyptic literature? Fear or love? Should religious authority emphasize? To different canonical choices, different answers led. Significantly, these decisions were influenced by geography. More receptive to apocalyptic literature, Eastern churches proved, than Western ones. Texts that Romans rejected were preserved by Syrian and Ethiopian Christians, more than pure doctrinal considerations. Cultural factors shaped theological preferences. In communities that valued moral instruction over theological sophistication, the Apocalypse of Peter survived longest. More useful than abstract discussions of divine nature, rural churches found its clear messages about divine justice. Its direct approach to complex questions was appreciated by simple believers. But with the text's primitive theology, urban intellectuals grew increasingly uncomfortable. Of human nature and divine justice, more nuanced understanding was developed by them. Beneath emerging Christian philosophy, the Apocalypse's mechanical approach to moral accounting seemed. Also, canonical decisions were influenced by economic factors. Money was cost by papyrus. Payment was required by scribes. Which texts deserved copying and preservation had to be chosen by communities. Popular texts survived while into obscurity, marginal ones disappeared. Ground was gradually lost by the Apocalypse of Peter in this competitive environment. The winnowing process was accelerated by political pressures. Unified doctrine to maintain institutional coherence was needed by church leaders. Confusion and division were created by too many competing texts. Establish ecclesiastical authority and theological consistency were helped by canonical boundaries. Doctrinal disputes were addressed by the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, but canonical questions were avoided. To later authorities like Athanasius of Alexandria, that work fell, whose annual letters listed approved books for church use. The New Testament canon was effectively established by his Easter letter of 367 CE. The final cut was not made by the Apocalypse of Peter. With developing Christian emphasis on divine love and mercy, its graphic descriptions of divine punishment seemed incompatible. Texts that balanced judgment with hope for redemption were preferred by church leaders, but immediate disappearance was not meant by exclusion from the canon. Privately, the Apocalypse continued to be read by many Christians. Alongside other non-canonical texts, copies were preserved by monasteries. Even after losing official recognition, underground existence was maintained by the book. The text was occasionally rediscovered by medieval Christians, and they wondered why by earlier generations it had been rejected. To reformers who sought to revive primitive Christian intensity, its moral clarity appealed. But such interest was consistently discouraged by church authorities. Paths that early Christianity chose not to follow are revealed by the shadow canon, alternative gospels that different aspects of Jesus' teaching emphasized, letters that concerns the canonical ones ignored addressed, apocalypses that, with varying degrees of mercy, divine justice described. What early believers considered possible are shown to us by these rejected texts. The range of options available before doctrinal boundaries hardened are revealed under different circumstances. How differently Christianity might have developed is demonstrated. One such alternative path is represented by the Apocalypse of Peter, a Christianity more concerned with moral accounting than theological sophistication, a faith that over humble acceptance of divine mystery valued detailed knowledge of divine justice, a religion that, as motivation for righteous behavior, preferred fear to comfort. Christianity's choice of certain values over others is signaled by its rejection, over justice, mercy, over fear, hope, over moral simplicity, theological sophistication. Everything that followed was shaped by these choices. What millions would believe about divine nature and human destiny was determined. Yet, Christian consciousness continues to be haunted by the shadow canon. Periodically, rejected texts surface. About roads not taken, questions are raised. To confront the contingent nature of their doctrine, believers are forced that other voices once claimed equal authority. They are reminded. As monument to this alternative Christianity, the Apocalypse of Peter stands. Moral imagination that official doctrine chose to suppress is preserved by its vivid descriptions of divine justice. Anxieties that canonical texts address more subtly are revealed by its detailed accounting of sin and punishment. How remarkable the canonical process was helps us appreciate understanding the shadow canon. Choices that would influence billions of future believers were made by early Christians. Which voices would be heard and which would fall silent was decided by them. Not just doctrine but entire civilization's understanding of divine truth was shaped. Heaven, hell, and the moral calculus explained. Like a divine court system, the Apocalypse of Peter operates. Its precisely calculated sentence is received by every sin. Its crime with mathematical precision is fit by every punishment. No excess, no mercy, no possibility for appeal. As perfect moral accounting, divine justice functions. By their tongues, blasphemers are hanging suspended. To speak against God, the organ they use becomes their eternal anchor. Beneath them, hot metal is flowing, close enough for its heat to be felt, but never close enough for the release of destruction to be provided. In permanent anticipation of a fall that never arrives, they dangle. Their hair has become unbreakable cord, is what women who beautified themselves to seduce married men discover. Over chasms of flame, they hang by these carefully cultivated locks, to perfect their appearance. The vanity that drove them now their perfect suffering ensures. The instrument of justice becomes beauty, immersed in molten gold up to their necks. Rich men who refuse charity to the poor find themselves. Around them, the wealth they hoarded is melting. Neither comfort nor purchase is provided. What they once pursued, they cannot escape. Their torment becomes their treasure, unnaturally extending toward pools of boiling pitch. Those who charged excessive interest on loans discover their hands and feet. For relief that remains forever beyond their grasp, they reach desperately. From human compassion, their greed created distance. Their eternal condition is defined by distance now. Repeatedly, death is faced by murderers. High towers they climb, over edges they feel themselves pushed, Every sensation of fatal impact is experienced. Then, to climb again, they immediately reform. Of their victims' final moments, complete awareness is brought by each death. Too late to provide comfort, empathy arrives. More than the cruelty, the precision astounds. With scientific accuracy, divine justice operates. Not just the sin, but the specific manner of sinning is reflected by each punishment. By their ears, liars who whispered secrets are hanging. By their tongues, those who spoke false witness are hanging. Instruments of instruction become body parts. Beside crystal streams in meadows, children who died before reaching moral awareness are playing. To the groaning of the damned, their laughter provides counterpoint. Protection is received by innocence, while education is received by guilt. Perfect balance is maintained by the moral universe. Each punishment is supervised by angels with bureaucratic efficiency. Against sin, suffering is measured. To match moral weight, intensity is adjusted. No emotion is shown by their faces, only dedication to accurate implementation of divine justice. The system's integrity would be compromised by mercy. These punishments without distress are observed by the righteous dead. Proper emotional response to divine justice is included in their sanctification. That rather than diminishes divine love, accountability enhances is what they understand. In the terrible symmetry, beauty is what they see. But punishments that exceed easy description are received by certain crimes. Torments that the text struggles to convey are faced by those who corrupted children. Irreversible was the damage they inflicted. Therefore, incomprehensible must be their punishment. Moral mathematics are broken by some sins. Rather than physical torment, psychological torment is experienced by false prophets who led believers astray. Multiplied across all their victims, the despair their lies produced is what they feel. Every lost soul, every damaged faith, every spiritual wound their deception created, the weight they carry, permanently removed. Religious hypocrites find their public masks. Behind pretense or reputation, they cannot hide. To all, their inner corruption becomes visible. Without possibility of concealment or redemption, shame is experienced. Their torment becomes truth. Beyond individual actions to their consequences, the moral calculus extends. A marriage might be destroyed by a single lie. Children might be impoverished. Multiple families might be ruined. For every ripple effect, divine justice accounts, not just for their choices but for all results. Those choices generated, sinners bear responsibility. The instruments of their torture have become their false weights and measures, is what greedy merchants discover. Massive scales that never balance must be carried by them. Accuracy they never practiced in life is pursued. Of their instruction become the tools of their deception. In regions where deception becomes impossible, those who practiced witchcraft or consulted spirits find themselves. Through forbidden means, hidden knowledge was sought by them. Of their situation with no power to change it, complete knowledge they now possess. Their punishment becomes truth without hope. Moral categories are reflected by the geography of hell. Different types of sinners are housed in different regions. Various classes of criminals are separated by rivers of fire. About the organization of evil and the precision of divine response, the landscape itself teaches lessons. Yet that educational purposes are served by this justice is maintained by the text. What the sinner failed to learn during life is taught by each punishment. Curriculum becomes pain. Into understanding, suffering is transformed. Though too late to alter consequences does understanding come. Rewards that mirror their earthly choices are received by the righteous dead. Eternally, without gluttony, those who fed the hungry feast. Garments of light that never fade are worn by those who clothed the naked. In perfect freedom, those who visited prisoners walk. In both directions, justice operates. Where with patriarchs and prophets the faithful walk, gardens bloom. Without drowning, streams of living water refresh. With foods that nourish without causing satiation, tables are spread. By different laws than earth, paradise operates, but the same moral logic applies. A universe where infinitely every choice matters is presented by the apocalypse of Peter. Without consequence, no action disappears. Divine attention is not escaped by any thought. With perfect accuracy, the moral calculus operates. For every variable in the equation of human responsibility accounting both terrifies and comforts this comprehensive moral accounting. Because escape becomes impossible, it terrifies. Because correction is received by injustice, it comforts. That good and evil receive their proper rewards, the system guarantees. Perfect order is ensured by perfect justice. But about divine nature, troubling questions are raised by the text. Perfect cruelty, does perfect justice require? Eternal suffering, does moral instruction justify? The crimes, do the punishments fit? Or human capacity to commit equivalent evil, do they exceed? To the text's exclusion from canonical scripture, these questions would eventually contribute. With divine justice that seemed to exceed divine mercy, church leaders grew uncomfortable. Of divine nature that emphasized forgiveness alongside accountability, more balanced portraits were preferred. Yet moral imagination that canonical texts address more subtly is preserved by the Apocalypse of Peter, grappling with fundamental questions about justice, responsibility, and divine governance. Early Christians are shown to us. About ultimate moral reality, their hunger for detailed knowledge is revealed. To modern sensibilities, the moral calculus it presents may seem primitive, but permanent human concerns about justice and accountability it addresses. That choices matter, that actions have consequences, that with perfect accuracy divine governance operates, it promises. That transcend cultural boundaries, such assurances appeal to moral intuitions. The rise of apocalyptic literature across time. The world was coming to an end. Through Jerusalem's streets, Roman boots were marching. The temple was burning. Priests were being scattered. Sacrifices were ceasing. Beneath imperial wheels, Jewish hope appeared crushed. In such darkness, visions were flourishing. When by earthly powers divine order is destroyed, restoration is promised by heavenly voices. From oppression like flowers from scorched earth, apocalyptic literature emerges. During Babylonian exile, the pattern was first established by Daniel. When over holy ground foreign gods ruled, hidden truths were revealed by divine visions. Between good and evil, cosmic battles were shown by heavenly tours. Into spiritual victory, earthly defeat was transformed. With elaborate descriptions of celestial realms, this tradition was expanded by the Book of Enoch. Human bloodlines were corrupted by fallen angels. The earth was walked by giants. With mathematical precision, divine judgment was approaching. Eventual justice was promised by complex moral accounting. Divine purposes were served by every detail of cosmic history. Fresh soil for apocalyptic imagination was provided by Roman oppression. Against overwhelming force, impossible battles were fought by Jewish rebels. Against imperial machinery, traditional religion seemed powerless. On seemingly hopeless situations, alternative perspectives were offered by apocalyptic writers. As resistance literature, disguised as religious vision, these texts operated. That, despite appearances, earthly empires serve divine plans was promised by them. In seemingly invincible powers, hidden weaknesses were revealed. By describing ultimate victory for the faithful, endurance was encouraged. Along with Jewish scriptures, this apocalyptic worldview was inherited by early Christians. About coming judgment and divine vindication, Jesus himself spoke apocalyptically. Imminent transformation of earthly conditions was expected by his followers. All earthly kingdoms would be replaced by the kingdom of heaven, but delay came to the expected transformation. Without establishing visible kingdom, Jesus ascended. Without witnessing promised return, disciples died. Rather than weaker, Roman power grew stronger. For continuing oppression, Christians needed new explanations. Those explanations were provided by apocalyptic literature. Why suffering continued, and when it would end, were revealed by texts like the Apocalypse of Peter. Invisible to human eyes, cosmic battles were described. That larger divine purposes were served by apparent delay was promised. For embattled Christian communities, several advantages were offered by the genre. As part of divine plan, present suffering was explained. About future vindication, detailed knowledge was provided. Through vivid descriptions of eventual reward, endurance was encouraged. Into victors, through prophetic vision, victims were transformed. Through divine revelation rather than human learning, authority was claimed by apocalyptic authors. From heavenly sources, visions were received directly by them. Under angelic guidance, cosmic realms were toured. Planning earthly events, divine councils were witnessed. Traditional religious hierarchies were bypassed by such claims. To marginalized communities, this democratization of divine revelation appealed. Extraordinary visions could be received by ordinary believers. Prophetic voices could become social outcasts. From divine choice rather than institutional position, religious authority flowed. Traditional power structures were leveled by apocalyptic literature. About invisible realities, intellectual curiosity was also satisfied by the texts. About heavenly realms, detailed knowledge was wanted by people. About divine justice, specific information was sought. Of cosmic purpose, complete explanations were desired. Such comprehensive answers were provided by apocalyptic literature. Christian apocalyptic imagination was shaped by Greek philosophical influence. About invisible perfection behind visible shadows, Platonic ideas encouraged belief in heavenly realms more real than earthly ones. Detailed moral accounting was supported by Stoic concepts of divine governance. Prophetic vision was enriched by philosophical vocabulary, but distinctly Jewish and Christian concerns were maintained by apocalyptic literature. On historical transformation rather than philosophical contemplation, it focused. In human affairs rather than abstract speculation, divine action was emphasized. For the oppressed rather than wisdom for the elite, justice was promised. This tradition's maturation within Christian circles is represented by the Apocalypse of Peter. With Christian salvation history, Jewish moral categories are combined. To describe Hebrew prophetic vision, Greek philosophical concepts are used. Through divine revelation, Roman oppression is addressed. Legal thinking influenced by Roman jurisprudence is reflected by the text's detailed punishments. Proportionate punishment is received by each crime. Through systematic application of universal principles, justice operates. Earthly law is mirrored by divine law, while its limitations are transcended. Yet of earthly justice systems, prophetic criticism is maintained by the apocalypse. How human ones are exceeded by divine standards is revealed. Where earthly courts fail, perfect accountability is promised. In cosmic venues, hidden crimes receive public punishment is assured to readers. During periods of cultural crisis, when inadequate traditional authorities seemed, apocalyptic literature thrived. Of meaning and hope, alternative sources were provided by the genre. Behind apparent chaos, divine purposes were revealed. For faithful endurance, ultimate vindication was promised. But the appeal of apocalyptic literature was also limited by the same conditions that generated it. Less need for cosmic explanations of earthly suffering was felt by communities when external pressure decreased. Less confrontational theology was preferred by churches when social acceptance was gained. For comprehensive moral explanations, humanity's need is reflected by the rise of apocalyptic literature. Why suffering exists and when it will end is what people want to understand. That ultimately justice will prevail is the assurance they seek. About divine governance, detailed knowledge they desire. Particular historical circumstances are transcended by these needs. Situations that seem to exceed human capacity for resolution are faced by every generation. Injustices that earthly powers cannot or will not correct are witnessed by every age. Of ultimate accountability, visions are produced by every culture. From early Christianity's formative period, one such vision is preserved by the Apocalypse of Peter. About divine justice and human responsibility, believers grappling with fundamental questions are shown to us. That underlying apparent chaos is cosmic order. Their confidence is revealed. But of purely descriptive approaches to spiritual mystery, the limitations are also demonstrated. Detailed explanation is resisted by some realities. Human categories are transcended by some truths. Faith, rather than knowledge, is required by some questions. Both achievement and failure of religious imagination is marked by the rise of apocalyptic literature. In maintaining hope during desperate circumstances, it succeeds. When humble trust in divine wisdom is replaced by detailed predictions, it fails. Both this success and this failure are embodied by the apocalypse of Peter. Peter, the common man, elevated. Through the Gospels, like a man learning to walk on water, Simon called Peter stumbles. Before thinking, he speaks. Before understanding, he acts. More than he can deliver, he promises. Yet as foundation stone for the church to come, Jesus chooses him. Potential that human eyes miss is perhaps seen by divine wisdom. No theological training was possessed by the fisherman from Galilee, no rabbinical credentials, no family connections to religious authority. With his hands, he worked. With provincial accent, he spoke. The smell of fish and lake water he carried. As morning bread common, as evening prayer ordinary. But for early Christian purposes, extraordinary was made by ordinariness. An apostolic figure they could understand was needed by believers. Someone who, like they did, struggled with doubt. Someone who spectacularly failed, then found forgiveness. Someone whose weaknesses made visible divine grace. Paradoxically reassuring to later Christians became Peter's denials during Jesus' trial. So completely under pressure, if the chief apostle could fail, then over their own failures, ordinary believers need not despair. Despite his betrayal, if to fellowship Peter could be restored, then for everyone, redemption remained possible. Perfectly with this pattern, the vision recorded in the Apocalypse of Peter fits. Despite his moral failures, divine justice with startling clarity is seen by Peter. Detailed revelation about cosmic judgment is received by the same man who denied knowing Jesus through flawed vessels rather than perfect ones. Grace operates. More encouraging than Paul's brilliance or John's mystical insights, Peter's humanity was found by early Christian communities. With his learning and rhetorical skill, Paul intimidated, beyond ordinary comprehension, John soared. Accessible, Peter remained. Rather than strength displayed, through weakness made strong his spiritual authority came. This accessibility is exploited by the apocalypse attributed to Peter. Almost too intense for his simple nature, the visions seem. His human capacity is overwhelmed by divine revelation. To process what he sees, he struggles. Rather than less, more believable the visions are made by this struggle. With Peter's amazement at divine justice, readers identify. His horror at the punishments described is shared by them. His difficulty comprehending such complete moral accounting is understood. Through realms beyond human experience, their guide becomes the fisherman. Throughout the vision, ordinary human concerns are reflected by Peter's questions. Why so severe certain punishments seem, he wants to know. Divine mercy with divine justice, he struggles to reconcile. For suffering that exceeds apparent causes, explanation he seeks. Reader's confusion is mirrored by his confusion. As reluctant witness rather than eager prophet, Peter is presented by the text. About realities he would prefer to avoid, revelation he did not seek, is received. To his testimony, authenticity is added by this reluctance. For effect, eager prophets might exaggerate. More trustworthy, reluctant witnesses seem. Pedagogical purposes are also served by Peter's characterization. For detailed explanations, opportunities are created by his questions. Careful instruction is required by his confusion. To divine revelation, appropriate reactions are modeled by his emotional responses. Through his learning process, the text teaches. But in ways that earlier gospel portraits do not suggest, Peter is also transformed by the apocalypse. Patient observer of divine justice becomes the impulsive fisherman without protest. Eternal punishments are watched by the man who, in Jesus' defense, cut off a soldier's ear. No emotion at cosmic suffering is shown by the apostle who, over his denials, wept bitterly. Of spiritual maturation. Early Christian understanding is reflected by this transformation. Fundamentally, The disciples were changed by resurrection appearances. For divine revelation, new capacity was received. Rather than obstacles to spiritual understanding, channels for heavenly wisdom became their human limitations. To struggling believers, hope was offered by Peter's evolution from denier to visionary into apostolic authority. If such complete failure could be transformed by divine grace, then beyond redemption no one remained. Through divine intervention, the greatest saint could become the worst sinner. Peter's reputation for emotional volatility is exploited by the apocalypse. Credible witness to emotional content was made by his passionate nature, with detachment. Horrific punishments might be described by a cooler temperament. That the visions genuinely disturbed him, readers are convinced by Peter's intensity. Yet throughout his cosmic tour, composure to be maintained is required of Peter by the text. Questions he asks, but divine justice he never protests. Amazement he expresses, but to punishments he never objects. Subordinate to his prophetic function, his humanity remains. Peter, ideal vehicle for apocalyptic literature, was made by this balance between accessibility and authority. With his human struggles, believers could identify, while his divine revelations were accepted. His testimony was trusted because his limitations were recognized. His strengths were validated by his weaknesses. Theological claims are also legitimized by Peter's presence in the apocalypse. Weight that anonymous visions could not match was carried by the chief apostle's endorsement. Revelations bearing his name would be accepted by church communities already familiar with Peter's gospel appearances. As bridge between earthly and heavenly realms, Peter is presented by the text. Communication with ordinary believers is enabled by his human nature. Divine revelations are validated by his apostolic authority. Into comprehensible language, cosmic truths are translated by him. But, with the apocalypse's sophisticated moral categories, tension is created by Peter's everyman quality. Detailed knowledge of divine justice is suddenly demonstrated by the simple fisherman. To encompass theological concepts beyond his apparent education, his vocabulary expands. Broader challenges in apocalyptic literature are reflected by this tension, without exceeding their natural capacities. How do human authors convey divine revelations? While describing impossible experiences, how do they maintain credibility? To resolve these contradictions, the Peter figure attempts. As gift rather than achievement, Peter's visions are presented by the apocalypse. Through divine grace rather than human effort, revelation is received. While explaining his extraordinary knowledge, this emphasis preserves his humble status. The gap between human limitation and cosmic truth is bridged by divine initiative. Appropriate Christian attitudes toward divine justice are also modeled by Peter's emotional responses throughout the vision at heavenly realms. Proper awe is expressed. For human suffering, appropriate concern is shown. To divine authority, correct submission is demonstrated. How they should react to the apocalypse's content is taught to readers by these modeled responses. Instruction manual for proper spiritual response becomes Peter's emotional journey. The path believers should follow is charted by his transformation from confusion to acceptance. To address objections that later readers might raise, Peter's presence is used by the text. If excessive the punishments seem, their appropriateness is validated by Peter's acceptance. If unmerciful divine justice appears, its necessity is confirmed by Peter's acquiescence. Criticism is preempted by the apostle's approval. Yet, the apocalypse's theological sophistication is also limited by Peter's humanity. His apparent capacity would be exceeded by complex philosophical arguments. His simple nature might be confused by subtle theological distinctions. Consistency with his character must be maintained by the text while divine revelation is conveyed. The apocalypse's direct, literal approach to divine justice is shaped by this limitation. That he can understand and descriptions he can convey, visions are received by Peter. His interpretive abilities would be exceeded by the sophisticated allegory of canonical revelation. His straightforward nature is suited by simple moral categories. To ordinary Christian believers, the apocalypse of Peter, accessible, was made by Peter's everyman quality. In his confusion, his questions, his gradual understanding, themselves they saw. From someone who their struggles with faith and doubt shared, testimony was trusted. But, to the text's exclusion from canonical scripture, this same accessibility eventually contributed. Peter's simple moral categories seemed inadequate as more sophisticated theology was developed by Christianity. More nuanced approaches to divine justice were preferred by church leaders. Early Christianity's need for accessible apostolic authority was served by the fishermen from Galilee. Between divine revelation and human understanding, the gap was bridged. To ordinary minds, cosmic truths were made comprehensible. Extraordinary claims were validated by his presence. Yet the Apocalypse's theological development was also constrained by Peter's limitations. Beyond certain boundaries, without losing credibility, his character could not evolve. Within parameters established by gospel portraits, the text remained trapped. The Apocalypse of Peter maintains Peter's relatable quality while expanding it into the realm of prophetic power. What emerges shows us both what works and what doesn't when familiar characters are used to back up new divine messages. Sometimes being accessible and being authoritative clash in ways that hurt both goals. Rival visions of the final days. The world of early Christianity hummed with rival apocalypses. Every text made claims to divine backing. Every vision offered special understanding about where humanity would end up. Every apocalypse gathered loyal followers convinced their preferred revelation held the whole truth. The intellectual marketplace ran without any rules or oversight. Paul's apocalypse came out of monasteries in Egypt, claiming to show the apostles' trip through the heavenly spheres. Paul gets a guided walkthrough of paradise and places of punishment. Angels patiently lay out how divine justice works. This vision puts more weight on mercy than on judgment, on forgiveness rather than condemnation. Where Peter's apocalypse zeroes in on punishment matching the crime, Paul stresses God's compassion for human frailty. Those who've sinned get correction aimed at bringing them back, not just paying them back. Even the damned get Sunday breaks when their torments stop for a while. Divine love works right alongside divine justice. The shepherd of Hermas gives yet another angle on divine judgment. Hermas receives visions through an angelic go-between who shows up as a shepherd. These revelations emphasize turning from sin and moral change instead of cosmic punishment. Personal transformation counts for more than cosmic transformation. Hermas sees the church as a tower being built. Some stones slot perfectly into the divine design. Others need reshaping before they're any good. A handful must be thrown out completely. But the construction keeps going with patience and craftsmanship. Divine grace offers repeated chances for spiritual rebuilding. This vision connected with communities wrestling with membership issues. What about Christians who sin after their baptism? Can they be forgiven a second time? How many opportunities does divine mercy offer? The shepherd responds with hope instead of terror. The canonical revelation of John works on an entirely different scale. John witnesses cosmic warfare between good and evil. Dragons and beasts stand for earthly powers opposing divine rule. Symbolic numbers hide meanings about historical happenings and future shifts. John's visions need interpretation. The imagery functions on several levels at once. Earthly events mirror heavenly truths. Political movements fulfill prophetic blueprints. History moves toward its set climax despite visible chaos. Divine sovereignty covers every earthly possibility. These different strategies reflected different community requirements and theological tastes. City churches, with educated members, liked symbolic complexity. Country communities valued literal descriptions. Persecuted believers wanted cosmic payback. Established churches stressed moral teaching. The Apocalypse of Peter carved out a special spot in this competitive landscape. Its detailed punishments fed curiosity about divine justice. Its moral divisions offered clear rules for behavior. Its teaching approach worked for instruction. Its shocking content left lasting impressions. But stacking it against alternatives showed the text's weak points. Paul's Apocalypse brought more refined theology. Hermas delivered more pastoral care. John produced more literary skill. Peter's vision looked rough compared to these options. The competitive scene also pushed texts to evolve. Scribes expanded popular apocalypses with extra visions and explanations. Communities added local worries to universal revelations. Translations adjusted content for different cultural settings. Texts changed through use instead of staying frozen. This changeability makes pinning down original forms of early Christian apocalypses difficult. Multiple versions spread at the same time. Different communities kept different traditions. Scholars have to piece together development patterns from broken evidence. The Apocalypse of Peter lived on in multiple forms, showing this evolution. Ethiopian versions hold material missing from Greek pieces. Latin translations include sections not in Coptic texts. Each tradition kept some elements while dropping others. But certain features set Peter's Apocalypse apart from its rivals throughout this development. The exact matching of sin to punishment stayed constant. The literal take on divine justice held firm. The teaching emphasis carried across versions. These signature features attracted specific audiences while pushing others away. Communities, valuing moral instruction, liked the clear behavioral guidelines. Churches emphasizing theological depth found the literal approach troubling. The competitive scene gradually favored texts balancing multiple concerns well. John's revelation mixed symbolic richness with pastoral use. It spoke to persecution while keeping hope alive. It gave specific enough detail to feel real, while staying general enough to fit different situations. The Shepherd of Hermas succeeded by tackling practical questions about Christian life. It addressed real problems communities dealt with daily. Its visions served immediate needs instead of feeding abstract curiosity. Its authority came from usefulness rather than claims about apostolic writing. Paul's Apocalypse drew followers through its focus on divine mercy. It promised eventual healing for all creation. It balanced justice with forgiveness in ways that eased troubled consciences. Its theology moved past simple moral bookkeeping. These successful texts shared qualities Peter's Apocalypse lacked. They offered hope next to judgment. They brought theological sophistication alongside moral instruction. They balanced God's distance with God's closeness. They served multiple community functions instead of single purposes. The Apocalypse of Peter's eventual sidelining came partly from its failure to compete well in this varied marketplace. Its strengths spoke to particular audiences, but its limits alienated wider groups. Its graphic stuff both pulled in and pushed away potential readers. Yet the competitive environment also kept the text alive longer than it might have otherwise lasted. Different communities kept different canonical preferences. Texts rejected in one area found acceptance elsewhere. The Apocalypse of Peter kept circulating even after losing official recognition. The competing visions show how early Christianity wrestled with understanding divine justice and human fate. Different communities arrived at different answers about God's nature and human responsibility. Various apocalypses mirrored these diverse theological preferences. Modern readers gain from this diversity by seeing the range of choices available to early believers. The canonical process picked certain visions while tossing others. But the rejected alternatives show us what could have been. They reveal roads early Christianity chose not to travel. The Apocalypse of Peter represents one such alternative road. A Christianity focused mainly on moral accounting instead of theological sophistication. A faith that valued detailed knowledge of divine justice over humble acceptance of divine mystery. A religion that preferred fear over comfort as the push toward righteous living. Its competition with alternative visions helps explain both its temporary success and final failure. The text served important jobs for early Christian communities, but it couldn't adapt well to shifting theological preferences and pastoral requirements. Its stiffness became a problem rather than an asset. The Torments. A guided tour. The journey starts at the edge of a huge chasm. Peter stands next to Jesus on ground, feeling solid under his feet, yet somehow existing between earth and heaven. Before them spreads a landscape split by absolute moral geography. Light and shadow mark eternal borders no soul can cross. To the right, gardens bloom in endless spring. Clear streams wind between flowering trees. The righteous dead walk in robes of pure light, their faces showing perfect peace. They move with purpose but without rushing, caught up in conversations stretching across centuries without running out of topics. But Peter's attention pulls leftward, toward regions where divine justice works with surgical exactness. The air shimmers with heat from fires burning without using up fuel. Voices rise in harmonies of pain never reaching resolution. This is where sinners learn what they failed to grasp during life. The first region holds those who lied about their neighbors. They hang suspended by their tongues over pools of molten metal. The organ they use to wreck reputations becomes their eternal anchor. They can't speak, can't cry out, can't explain or make excuses. Truth becomes visible in their suffering. Their tongues stretch unnaturally long, carrying the full weight of their bodies. The flesh never rips despite the impossible strain. Divine justice makes sure punishment matches crime exactly. Those who whispered lies hang lower than those who shouted them loudly. Each position reflects the specific harm their words caused. Moving deeper into this moral landscape, Peter encounters women who decorated themselves to seduce other women's husbands. They hang by their carefully grown hair over pits of flame. The beauty they perfected for corruption now guarantees their perfect correction. Vanity becomes the tool of instruction. Their hair never burns despite closeness to the fires below. Each strand holds strong as iron, while staying sensitive to every feeling. They sense the heat, but can't escape it. Can't cut their locks or climb up. The very femininity they weaponized now traps them completely. In nearby regions, those who charged too much interest suffer punishments reflecting their greed. They stand submerged to their necks in rivers of molten gold. The wealth they chased now surrounds them entirely. They can't escape what they once wanted, can't buy relief with the treasure destroying them. Their hands reach constantly toward the surface but can't break through. The gold keeps perfect fluidity, offering no grip. They sink slightly with each desperate try to rise. Their treasure becomes their tomb, beautiful and terrible at once. Peter watches merchants who used rigged weights and measures. They carry massive scales, never reaching balance. The tools of their deception become instruments of their eternal education. They must chase accuracy they never practiced in life. Perfect weights stay forever out of their reach. Each scale grows heavier with use instead of lighter. The merchants stumble under growing burdens, reflecting the total damage their dishonesty created. They can't rest, can't hand off the work, can't drop their impossible task. Divine justice demands personal accountability. Those who practiced witchcraft or consulted forbidden spirits find themselves in regions where deception becomes impossible. They sought hidden knowledge through wrong channels. Now they possess complete knowledge of their situation with no power to alter it. Truth without hope becomes their punishment. Demons they once called up now work as their jailers. The spirits mock their former allies with perfect cruelty. The magical powers they pursued in life operate against them with flawless precision. Their occult knowledge reveals only how complete their condemnation is. Peter witnesses punishments for sins against children exceeding his ability to fully describe. The text itself struggles to express torments matching crimes so fundamentally destructive. Some corruptions shatter moral math entirely. Divine justice goes beyond human ability to grasp or explain. The geography itself teaches lessons about how evil is organized. Rivers of fire separate different categories of sinners. Each stream burns at temperatures matched to specific crimes. Those who harm children suffer in the hottest flames. Those who merely gossiped endure cooler correction. Angels move between regions with bureaucratic precision. They measure suffering against sin, adjusting intensity to keep perfect proportions. Their faces show no emotion, only commitment to accurate implementation of divine justice. Mercy would compromise the system's integrity. But the tour also reveals unexpected mercy within perfect justice. Children who died before reaching moral awareness play in meadows beside crystal streams. Their laughter provides contrast to adult suffering. Innocence receives protection while guilt receives education. The righteous dead observe these punishments without distress. Their sanctification includes proper emotional response to divine justice. They understand that accountability enhances, rather than lessens, divine love. They see beauty in the terrible symmetry keeping cosmic order. Peter's guide explains each punishment serves educational purposes. Pain becomes curriculum designed to teach what sinners failed to learn during life. Suffering transforms into understanding, though understanding comes too late to change consequences. Divine teaching works with infinite patience. The most elaborate punishments await religious hypocrites and false teachers. They experience psychological torments exceeding physical ones. They feel the despair their lives produced, multiplied across all their victims. They carry responsibility for every damaged soul their deception created. Their public masks stay permanently stripped away. They can't hide behind reputation or pretense. Their inner rot becomes visible to everyone. They experience shame with no possibility of concealment or redemption. Truth becomes their most unbearable torment. Some regions contain sinners whose crimes were so subtle earthly law couldn't touch them. Those who destroyed marriages through gossip. Those who corrupted children through bad example. Those who led others astray through spiritual carelessness. Divine justice accounts for every consequence of every choice. The detailed tour overwhelms Peter's human understanding. He struggles to process the scope of divine moral accounting. Every action monitored, every thought evaluated, every consequence traced to its source. The universe operates as a vast courtroom where nothing escapes judgment. As the vision ends, Peter grasps he has witnessed not random cruelty but educational consequence. Divine justice operates as a perfect teaching system designed to make truth inescapable. The punishments fit not just the crimes but the specific blindness that enabled them. The tour leaves Peter forever changed. He has seen the complete moral architecture of the universe. He understands every choice matters infinitely. He knows divine justice operates with mathematical precision, accounting for every variable in human responsibility. This knowledge becomes burden and blessing at the same time. Burden because the accounting terrifies. Blessing because justice guarantees evil receives what it deserves. The vision provides both warning and comfort, depending on the moral condition of whoever receives it. What the early church feared. Early Christian communities lived with death as their closest companion. Plagues tore through cities without warning. Childbirth killed mothers regularly. Violence erupted over religious differences. Roman authorities could order executions on imperial whim. Life ended suddenly, often brutally, always definitively. This closeness to death sharpened spiritual anxieties comfortable modern believers rarely feel. Death might arrive before repentance could be finished. Divine judgment might fall before moral reformation could be completed. Eternity might begin while spiritual accounts remained unbalanced. The Apocalypse of Peter speaks straight to these anxieties with surgical precision. Every fear gets detailed treatment. Every worry finds specific address. The text operates like a diagnostic manual for spiritual terror, listing symptoms while prescribing remedies through graphic deterrence. Christians feared their secret sins stayed hidden from human authority, but visible to divine surveillance. The Apocalypse confirms their worst suspicions. Divine justice operates with complete knowledge of every action, every thought, every hidden motive. Nothing escapes cosmic accounting. Private sins receive public punishment in Peter's vision. Adulterers who hid their crimes from spouses find their corruption displayed before all creation. Thieves who covered their tracks discover their greed exposed eternally. Secrecy offers no protection from ultimate revelation. But the text reveals early Christians feared specific sins more than others. Sexual corruption tops every punishment list. Those who violated marriage bonds, seduced virgins, or engaged in forbidden relationships face elaborate torments. Sexual purity obsessed early Christian communities. This obsession reflected cultural context more than universal moral principles. Roman society operated with sexual freedoms, scandalizing Jewish and Christian sensibilities. Temple prostitution normalized behaviors monotheistic faiths considered abominable. Sexual restraint became a marker of religious identity. Women who beautified themselves to attract inappropriate attention receive particular condemnation in the Apocalypse. Their hair becomes rope, their cosmetics become fire, their jewelry becomes chains. The text reveals deep anxiety about female sexuality and its power to corrupt male virtue. Early Christian communities struggled with questions about female participation in religious life. Could women teach? Could they speak in assemblies? Could they exercise authority over men? The Apocalypse of Peter suggests female beauty itself poses spiritual danger, requiring divine correction. Economic anxieties also fill the text's punishments. Merchants who cheated customers face eternal consequences. Those who charged excessive interest suffer molten gold immersion. Rich people who ignored poor neighbors endure carefully measured torments. Wealth itself becomes suspect. These concerns reflected economic realities in early Christian communities. Most believers belonged to artisan and merchant classes operating on narrow profit margins. Economic survival required careful attention to fair dealing. Religious communities depended on voluntary contributions wealth inequality could undermine. But the Apocalypse also reveals fears about religious authority and orthodoxy. False teachers face punishments exceeding those given to ordinary sinners. They experience psychological torments multiplying their victims' suffering. Their responsibility extends beyond personal sin to communal damage. Early Christianity lacked centralized authority to establish doctrinal boundaries. Multiple teachers competed for influence. Various interpretations of Christian truth circulated at the same time. Communities worried about following deceptive leaders who might jeopardize their eternal destinies. The text addresses parental anxieties about raising children in morally dangerous environments. Those who corrupted children through bad example or active harm faced torments beyond description. Parents needed assurance divine justice would protect innocence even when human law failed. Children represented both hope and vulnerability for early Christian communities. They carried faith into future generations, but required protection from corrupting influences. The Apocalypse promises those who damage young souls will face consequences matching their crimes' gravity. Religious hypocrisy generated particularly intense anxiety because it combined spiritual and social dangers. Hypocrites corrupted religious community while keeping public respect. They damaged faith from within while appearing exemplary from without. Their deception threatened both individual and communal salvation. The Apocalypse of Peter exposes religious masks with divine X-ray vision. Hypocrites can't maintain pretense under perfect scrutiny. Their inner corruption becomes visible to all. They experience shame with no possibility of concealment or redemption. Truth becomes their unbearable torment. Early Christians also feared divine justice might be delayed so long evil would seem to triumph permanently. The Apocalypse addresses this concern by providing detailed accounts of eventual punishment. Justice operates with perfect accuracy despite apparent delays, but the text reveals deeper fears about divine nature itself. Does perfect justice require perfect cruelty? Does moral instruction justify eternal suffering? Does divine love operate alongside divine wrath, or does one exclude the other? The Apocalypse provides answers later theologians would find troubling. The graphic punishment suggests early Christians imagined divine justice in thoroughly legal terms. Crime must be followed by proportionate punishment. Moral accounting must balance perfectly. Divine governance must operate according to principles human minds can understand and approve. This legalistic approach to divine justice both comforted and terrified early believers. It comforted because it guaranteed evil would receive correction. It terrified because it promised personal failures would also receive perfect punishment. Divine justice operated without favoritism or mercy. Women faced particular anxieties in early Christian communities because they possessed fewer legal protections and economic options. The Apocalypse addresses their concerns by showing divine justice protects the vulnerable while punishing those who exploit weakness. Yet the text also reveals cultural anxieties about female nature modern readers find disturbing. Women appear primarily as sources of temptation or victims of male corruption. Their spiritual capacity seems limited to roles supporting rather than leading religious communities. Early Christians feared their religious conversion might not protect them from divine judgment if their moral transformation remained incomplete. The Apocalypse suggests divine justice evaluates actual behavior rather than religious profession. Conversion provides opportunity rather than guarantee. This concern reflects the practical difficulties of moral reformation in corrupt environments. How could believers avoid contamination while remaining engaged with unconverted neighbors? How could they maintain spiritual purity while meeting economic necessities? The Apocalypse provides motivation through detailed consequences. The fears cataloged in the Apocalypse of Peter reveal early Christianity's struggle to maintain moral standards while engaging corrupt society. Believers needed clear boundaries between acceptable and forbidden behavior. They required detailed knowledge about divine expectations and consequences. But these same fears also shaped Christian theology in ways later generations would find problematic. The emphasis on punishment rather than restoration. The focus on individual accountability rather than communal transformation. The preference for fear rather than love as spiritual motivation. Understanding what early Christians feared helps explain both the Apocalypse of Peter's initial popularity and its eventual rejection. The text addressed real anxieties canonical books handled more subtly. It provided detailed answers sophisticated theology would consider inappropriate. Alexandria, the battleground of belief. The ancient city of Alexandria stretched along Egypt's coast like a jewel catching Mediterranean light. Ships from across the known world crowded its harbor, their holds heavy with goods and ideas. Merchants haggled in a dozen languages while scholars debated in shadowed courtyards. This was no ordinary port city. Alexandria had become the beating heart of early Christian thought. The great library stood as testament to human hunger for knowledge. Scrolls filled countless shelves, each one a doorway to wisdom or heresy, depending on who held the key. Christian scribes worked alongside pagan philosophers, Jewish rabbis, and mysterious followers of distant gods. Their reed pens scratched across papyrus, copying texts that would shape souls for centuries. In the narrow streets beyond the library, theological battles raged with surprising heat. Groups of believers gathered in homes and workshops, each claiming to possess the true gospel. Some followed the teachings of Arius, who argued Christ was lesser than the Father. Others embraced Gnostic mysteries, seeking secret knowledge hidden from common folk. Still others held fast to what they called orthodox faith, though that term meant different things to different people. The Apocalypse of Peter found fertile ground in this chaos of competing truths. Wealthy merchants funded scribes to copy the text, sensing its power to guide moral behavior in their trading houses. Ascetic monks carried handwritten versions into the desert, using Peter's visions to fuel their own spiritual discipline. Teachers in the catechetical school included passages in their lessons, watching as students' eyes widened at descriptions of divine justice. Alexandria's papyrus trade made copying texts remarkably easy. Local workshops could produce dozens of copies within weeks, spreading new ideas faster than anywhere else in the empire. The Apocalypse of Peter rode these currents of information, multiplying across the city's Christian communities like seeds on fertile wind. Theological debates in Alexandria often turned personal. Bishops accused rivals of teaching false doctrine, while crowds gathered to hear public arguments about Scripture. The Apocalypse of Peter became ammunition in these conflicts. Some leaders praised its moral clarity and apostolic authority. Others questioned its harsh imagery and uncertain origins. In the city's Jewish quarter, rabbis watched Christian developments with keen interest. Many recognized elements of their own apocalyptic traditions in Peter's visions. The descriptions of punishment echoed themes from the Book of Enoch and other texts their ancestors had treasured. This familiarity made some Jews more sympathetic to Christian claims, while others saw dangerous distortions of sacred truth. Women played crucial roles in Alexandria's Christian networks, though history has often forgotten their contributions. Wealthy widows funded copying projects and hosted house churches where new texts were read aloud. Female teachers shared Peter's visions with younger believers, emphasizing the text's warnings about moral purity and divine judgment. The Apocalypse of Peter thrived in Alexandria because the city itself embodied spiritual seeking. People came there hungry for answers to life's deepest questions. They wanted to know what waited beyond death, how to live righteously, and what God expected from faithful believers. Peter's detailed visions offered concrete answers to abstract fears. Alexandria's Christian communities developed their own interpretations of the text. Some emphasized its warnings about wealth and greed, appealing to working people struggling under Roman taxation. Others focused on punishments for false teaching, using Peter's authority to attack theological opponents. The text became a mirror, reflecting each group's particular anxieties and hopes. The city's intellectual atmosphere also bred criticism of the Apocalypse of Peter. Sophisticated theologians questioned its crude imagery and simplistic moral framework. They preferred more refined approaches to divine truth, finding Peter's visions uncomfortably vivid and theologically naive. These educated critics would eventually help turn opinion against the text. But for decades, Alexandria remained the Apocalypse of Peter's strongest fortress. The city's networks of believers, scribes, and teachers ensured its survival when other regions began to doubt. Alexandria had always been a place where dangerous ideas found welcome. The Apocalypse of Peter was simply the latest example of this ancient tradition. The case for inclusion. The year 200 brought unusual excitement to Christian communities across the empire. Bishops, teachers, and ordinary believers sensed they stood at a crossroads. The faith that had begun with a small group of fishermen and tax collectors now numbered in the hundreds of thousands. But with growth came questions demanding answers. Which books truly came from the apostles? What texts deserved a place alongside the Hebrew scriptures their Jewish ancestors had preserved? The Apocalypse of Peter entered these discussions with impressive credentials. Its title claimed apostolic authorship, linking it directly to the fishermen who had walked with Jesus. Early copies circulated with testimonies from respected church leaders who vouched for its authenticity. The text itself spoke with prophetic authority, offering detailed revelations about humanity's final destiny. Bishop Clement of Alexandria emerged as one of the text's strongest supporters. His reputation for learning and piety carried weight throughout the Christian world. Clement had studied both pagan philosophy and Christian scripture, giving him unique insight into distinguishing truth from error. When he endorsed the Apocalypse of Peter as genuine apostolic teaching, many believers took notice. Clement's arguments for inclusion rested on several pillars. The text's moral teachings aligned perfectly with other accepted Christian writings. Its emphasis on righteous living and divine justice echoed themes found in Matthew's Gospel and Paul's letters. The detailed descriptions of future punishment served a practical purpose, encouraging believers to resist temptation and persevere through persecution. The Muratorian fragment, a list of accepted Christian books from around 200, included the Apocalypse of Peter, alongside Gospels and epistles later generations would consider unquestionably canonical. This early recognition suggested broad acceptance among church leaders of the time. The text appeared to have passed whatever tests early Christians used to evaluate religious writings. Other influential voices joined the chorus of support. Methodius of Olympus praised the text's vivid portrayal of divine justice. Eusebius himself, despite later reservations, initially acknowledged its popularity and apostolic claims. Teachers in Christian schools used passages from the Apocalypse of Peter to illustrate moral lessons, treating it as scripture worthy of study and memorization. The text's supporters emphasized its practical value for Christian living. Unlike abstract theological treatises, the Apocalypse of Peter offered concrete images common believers could understand and remember. A merchant tempted to cheat customers might recall Peter's description of the greedy hanging by their tongues over lakes of fire. A parent struggling to discipline children could point to the text's warnings about those who disobey divine authority. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites supports the text's widespread acceptance. Fragments of the Apocalypse of Peter have been found in locations across the Mediterranean world, suggesting active copying and distribution networks. Some manuscripts show signs of heavy use, indicating regular reading in worship settings or personal devotion. The text also gained support through its connection to other respected apocalyptic writings. Christians already treasured the revelation of John despite its challenging symbolism and mysterious imagery. The Apocalypse of Peter offered a companion vision, filling gaps in understanding about the afterlife John's text left unexplored. Together, they seemed to provide a complete picture of humanity's ultimate destiny. Political considerations also favored inclusion. The Roman Empire continued to persecute Christians sporadically, creating ongoing pressure to maintain unity and orthodoxy. Texts emphasizing divine judgment against the wicked offered comfort to believers suffering under imperial oppression. The Apocalypse of Peter promised earthly injustices would be corrected in the world to come. Liturgical use provided another argument for canonization. Several Christian communities incorporated readings from the Apocalypse of Peter into their worship services, particularly during seasons focused on repentance and preparation for Christ's return. This practical acceptance suggested ordinary believers found the text spiritually nourishing and doctrinally sound. The momentum for inclusion seemed unstoppable during the early 3rd century. Respected bishops endorsed the text. Scholars defended its authenticity, and believers across the empire treasured its teachings. The Apocalypse of Peter appeared destined to join the collection of books that would define Christian faith for future generations. But appearances, as the text itself warned, could be deceiving. The case for exclusion. The tide began to turn in unexpected ways. Bishop Serapion of Antioch stood before his congregation one morning, his face grave with concern. Word had reached him about a church in nearby Rossus that had been reading from the Gospel of Peter during worship services. Initially, Serapion had approved the practice, trusting the apostolic name attached to the text. But deeper investigation revealed troubling doctrinal problems, forcing him to reverse his position. This incident, recorded in church history, marked a turning point in attitudes toward Petrine literature. If one text bearing Peter's name could mislead believers, perhaps others deserved closer scrutiny. The Apocalypse of Peter, despite its popularity, found itself caught in this wave of suspicion about pseudepigraphic writings. Theological objections multiplied as scholars examined the text more carefully. The crude descriptions of punishment seemed beneath the dignity of divine revelation. Critics argued God's justice operated through spiritual transformation rather than physical torture. The Apocalypse of Peter's graphic imagery reduced complex theological concepts to simple cause and effect relationships sophisticated believers found intellectually unsatisfying. Questions about authorship proved particularly damaging. Advanced textual analysis revealed linguistic patterns inconsistent with first-century Palestinian origins. The Greek showed influences from later periods and different geographical regions. Scholars who had initially accepted Petrine authorship began to doubt whether the historical Peter could have produced such a work. The text's moral framework also drew criticism from unexpected quarters. Some church leaders worried its emphasis on punishment through fear rather than love contradicted core Christian teachings about divine mercy and redemption. The Apocalypse of Peter seemed to encourage believers to avoid sin primarily to escape consequences rather than to grow in holiness and compassion. Doctrinal concerns multiplied as theological understanding became more sophisticated. The text's anthropology, or understanding of human nature, appeared overly simplistic to teachers grappling with complex questions about the soul, resurrection, and eternal destiny. Its eschatology, or teaching about the end times, seemed to conflict with more nuanced interpretations of Christ's second coming and final judgment. Regional variations in Christian practice created additional problems for the Apocalypse of Peter. Churches in different areas had developed distinct traditions about which texts to read in worship and instruction. The text remained popular in some regions while falling out of favor in others. This geographical division undermined claims about its universal acceptance and apostolic authority. The rise of Montanism, a charismatic movement emphasizing new prophecies and strict moral discipline, inadvertently damaged the Apocalypse of Peter's reputation. Montanists embraced the text's harsh moral tone and detailed prophetic visions, using it to support their own controversial teachings. Mainstream church leaders, already suspicious of Montanist excesses, began to view the Apocalypse of Peter as potentially dangerous to Orthodox faith. Literary criticism contributed to growing doubts about the text's value. Educated Christians compared it unfavorably to the Revelation of John, finding Peter's visions less sophisticated in their symbolism and theological insight. The Apocalypse of Peter seemed to appeal primarily to simple believers who preferred concrete imagery over deeper spiritual truths. Practical concerns about the text's effects on Christian behavior also emerged. Some church leaders noticed communities emphasizing the Apocalypse of Peter developed unhealthy preoccupations with sin and punishment. Instead of producing joy and spiritual growth, the text seemed to generate anxiety and legalistic approaches to faith that hindered rather than helped Christian maturity. The growing influence of Alexandrian theology, with its emphasis on spiritual rather than literal interpretation of Scripture, created an intellectual climate hostile to the Apocalypse of Peter's straightforward approach. Scholars like Origen preferred texts yielding rich allegorical meanings rather than simple moral lessons. The Apocalypse of Peter seemed too obvious, too lacking in hidden depths to satisfy sophisticated theological inquiry. Economic factors may have played a role in the text's decline. The expense of copying manuscripts meant Christian communities had to make choices about which books to preserve and transmit. As doubts grew about the Apocalypse of Peter's authenticity and value, scribes and patrons began to invest their resources in texts with stronger claims to apostolic authority and theological importance. The case for exclusion gained momentum through cumulative effect rather than any single decisive argument. Multiple concerns combined to create doubt where once there had been confidence. The Apocalypse of Peter's supporters found themselves fighting on too many fronts simultaneously, unable to address all the objections raised against their beloved text. Eusebius and the power to erase. History remembers Eusebius of Caesarea as the father of church history, but his true power lay in shaping which memories would survive. In his great work, The Ecclesiastical History, completed around 325, this scholarly bishop created categories that would determine the fate of countless Christian texts for centuries to come. His pen became a sword that could elevate writings to sacred status or consign them to the shadows of doubt. Eusebius divided Christian literature into 4 careful categories. The accepted books included the 4 Gospels, Paul's letters, and other texts enjoying universal recognition. The disputed books had some support, but faced questions about authenticity or doctrine. The spurious writings bore names of apostles, but clearly came from later authors. The heretical books promoted false teachings, threatening Orthodox faith. The Apocalypse of Peter found itself placed in the disputed category, a classification carrying the weight of scholarly authority throughout the Christian world. Eusebius acknowledged the text's popularity and historical support, while expressing reservations about its ultimate value. This measured judgment reflected his careful methodology, but it also sealed the text's fate in ways he may not have fully anticipated. Eusebius possessed access to libraries and archives few contemporaries could match. His position as Bishop of Caesarea gave him connections to Christian communities across the Eastern Empire. He could consult manuscripts, interview elderly believers, and trace the transmission of texts through multiple generations. This extensive research gave his judgments unusual authority among church leaders seeking guidance about contested writings. The historian's personal theological preferences influenced his evaluations in subtle but significant ways. Eusebius favored texts supporting imperial Christianity's emphasis on order, authority, and unity. The Apocalypse of Peter's graphic imagery and appeal to popular religious sensibilities made him uncomfortable. He preferred the sophisticated symbolism of John's revelation and the theological depth of Paul's letters. Eusebius also had to navigate the political realities of his time. Emperor Constantine had recently converted to Christianity, ending centuries of persecution, but creating new pressures for religious uniformity. Church councils were beginning to address doctrinal disputes threatening Christian unity. In this environment, texts like the Apocalypse of Peter seemed potentially divisive rather than helpful for building consensus. The historian's influence extended far beyond his own lifetime through the copying and preservation of his works. Medieval scribes treated Eusebius as the ultimate authority on early Christian literature. His categories became standard reference points for determining which texts deserved study and which could be safely ignored. The disputed label attached to the Apocalypse of Peter discouraged copying and transmission in ways proving increasingly fatal over time. Regional differences in manuscript preservation amplified Eusebius's impact. Communities in the Eastern Empire, where his influence was strongest, gradually abandoned texts he had questioned. Western churches maintained some disputed writings longer, but eventually followed Eastern precedents in most cases. The Apocalypse of Peter survived longer in Egypt and Syria than in Greece or Asia Minor, but even these strongholds eventually succumbed to scholarly consensus. Eusebius's methodology, while impressive for its time, contained biases modern scholars recognize but ancient readers accepted without question. He privileged written testimony over oral tradition, formal theological discourse over popular religious expression, and institutional authority over grassroots acceptance. These preferences systematically disadvantaged texts like the Apocalypse of Peter that had thrived in different contexts. The historian's treatment of apocalyptic literature reflected broader changes in Christian intellectual culture. The Church was moving away from expectation of imminent divine intervention toward accommodation with existing social and political structures. Graphic visions of divine judgment seemed less relevant to Christians beginning to exercise earthly power themselves. Eusebius embodied this shift in his scholarly preferences and canonical judgments. Economic factors reinforced the effects of Eusebius's scholarly authority. Manuscript copying remained expensive and time-consuming throughout the ancient and medieval periods. Christian communities had to make choices about which texts to preserve and transmit. Once Eusebius had labeled the Apocalypse of Peter as disputed, patrons and scribes naturally prioritized resources for texts with stronger scholarly endorsement. The irony of Eusebius's power lies in its unintended consequences. By creating systematic categories for evaluating Christian literature, he provided tools later scholars could use to question his own judgments. Modern discoveries of ancient manuscripts have revealed the popularity and influence of texts he dismissed or marginalized. The Apocalypse of Peter has found new life precisely because contemporary scholars recognized the limitations of 4th-century canonical decisions. Eusebius wielded his pen with careful precision, but the cumulative effect of his judgments reshaped Christian memory in ways continuing to influence religious understanding today. The texts he preserved became scripture, while those he questioned faded into scholarly footnotes. His categories seemed objective and neutral, but they carried the full weight of imperial Christianity's emerging orthodoxy. The Apocalypse of Peter became a casualty of this process, neither heretical enough to generate passionate opposition, nor accepted enough to ensure preservation. Hell evolves. The medieval mind possessed an appetite for divine punishment that would have impressed even the author of the Apocalypse of Peter. But where the ancient text offered simple moral equations, later Christians demanded elaborate theological systems that could map the geography of damnation with scientific precision. Hell evolved from Peter's straightforward vision into something far more complex and terrifying. Dante Alighieri stood in his study one winter evening in 1308, surrounded by manuscripts and memories of political exile. He had lost everything he once valued: his city, his position, his certainty about divine justice. The inferno pouring from his pen over the following years would transform Christian imagination more completely than any text since the New Testament itself. Yet traces of the Apocalypse of Peter whispered through his carefully constructed circles of punishment. The connection between Peter's visions and Dante's masterpiece runs deeper than mere literary influence. Both texts sought to make abstract concepts of divine justice concrete and memorable. Both authors understood moral instruction required vivid imagery lingering in readers' minds long after the immediate reading experience ended. Both recognized fear of punishment, while not the highest motivation for righteous living, remained a powerful tool for shaping human behavior. Medieval theologians had systematized punishment in ways that would have astonished early Christians. They developed precise categories for different types of sin, matching each transgression with appropriate eternal consequences. The Apocalypse of Peter's relatively simple catalog of torments gave way to elaborate schemes accounting for every possible moral failure with mathematical precision. Thomas Aquinas contributed philosophical rigor to discussions of eternal punishment, elevating speculation to the level of systematic theology. His Summa Theologica devoted careful attention to questions about the nature of hellish torment, the relationship between spiritual and physical punishment, and the justice of eternal consequences for temporal sins. These scholarly discussions moved far beyond the vivid but unsophisticated imagery of the Apocalypse of Peter. Art and architecture carried hell's evolution into popular consciousness through channels reaching believers who never read theological treatises. Cathedral sculptures depicted the damned with increasing graphic detail, while illuminated manuscripts provided intimate glimpses of punishment, making Peter's visions seem almost restrained by comparison. The Last Judgment became a favorite subject for artists competing to create the most memorable images of divine wrath. Mystery plays brought hell to life on medieval stages with mechanical ingenuity, delighting audiences hungry for spectacle. Elaborate stage devices created the impression of real fire and smoke, while actors costumed as demons tormented the wicked with theatrical enthusiasm. These performances made the abstract concepts of eternal punishment immediate and entertaining in ways ancient texts could never achieve. The Black Death of the 14th century intensified Christian preoccupation with death and judgment in ways creating new audiences for infernal literature. Survivors of the plague sought meaning in their suffering and assurance divine justice would ultimately prevail. Texts describing punishment of the wicked provided psychological comfort to believers struggling to understand why God had permitted such widespread devastation. Purgatory emerged as a theological innovation, addressing practical pastoral concerns about the fate of ordinary believers dying neither perfectly righteous nor utterly wicked. This middle state required its own geography and population, leading to elaborate descriptions paralleling but not replacing traditional hell. The Apocalypse of Peter's binary division between saved and damned seemed increasingly inadequate for addressing complex moral realities. Renaissance humanism introduced new perspectives on human dignity, creating tension with traditional emphasis on punishment and divine wrath. Scholars rediscovering classical literature found Greek and Roman approaches to ethics emphasizing virtue rather than fear as the primary motivation for good behavior. These influences gradually undermined the cultural foundations supporting texts like the Apocalypse of Peter. Protestant reformers retained belief in hell while rejecting many medieval elaborations as unscriptural speculation. Martin Luther and John Calvin emphasized divine sovereignty and human depravity in ways making eternal punishment seem both necessary and just, but they preferred biblical imagery to the creative expansions characterizing medieval treatments of the subject. The printing press brought literature about punishment and eternal damnation to the masses, while at the same time, it made it simpler for skeptics to place different texts alongside each other and spot their internal contradictions. People who read could now look at various portrayals of hell together, marking down the inconsistencies and raising doubts about long-standing religious authorities. The Apocalypse of Peter's fairly straightforward methodology started to appear outdated when compared with more refined alternatives that emerged later. Scientific progress introduced fresh obstacles for those who interpreted physical torment in hell, in literal terms. Better knowledge of human anatomy, the laws of physics, and geographical realities caused the conventional descriptions to appear more and more far-fetched to those with education. Religious scholars reacted by highlighting the spiritual dimensions of everlasting punishment instead of the physical ones, which further separated them from the tangible visual language that had once made the Apocalypse of Peter so powerful to audiences in ancient times. Contemporary psychology has reshaped the old worries about guilt and divine retribution in such a way that ancient apocalyptic writings now appear mentally harmful instead of spiritually uplifting. Christians today frequently regard the focus on terror and punishment as barriers to their spiritual development instead of tools that support moral growth. The teaching strategy employed by the Apocalypse of Peter clashes with the therapeutic frameworks of religious instruction that currently shape pastoral work. Hell keeps changing in mainstream culture through novels, movies, and online platforms that reimagine classic themes for today's viewers. However, these contemporary versions usually prioritize entertainment instead of moral teaching, flipping the goals that drove the ancient writers of apocalyptic texts. The Apocalypse of Peter's genuine preoccupation with righteousness appears almost charming when you compare it to how we handle infernal imagery now. In the forgotten corners of ancient libraries, the lost versions of Christianity exist. Overlooked voices quietly tell the tales of what could have happened. The Christianity we recognize today is just one limb of an enormous tree that once spread in countless directions. The Apocalypse of Peter serves as proof of paths that were never followed, opportunities that were real before religious councils and emperors chose which interpretation of the faith would endure. The earliest groups of Christians looked more like an open marketplace than a single, unified movement. People who followed Jesus met in house churches spread throughout the Mediterranean region. Every group formed their own interpretation of what their teacher had said. Some highlighted his divine nature, while others concentrated on his human side. Some valued his ethical guidance, while others pursued mystical connection with his essence. The Apocalypse of Peter came out of this inventive disorder, presenting one community's picture of absolute reality. Gnostic Christians believed they had special insight that offered freedom from the restrictions of the physical realm. Their writings portrayed an intricate spiritual cosmos, packed with divine emanations and cosmic battles between illumination and shadow. The Apocalypse of Peter appeared unsophisticated and too focused on material things to those seeking to escape physical reality instead of seeing it changed through divine judgment. Jewish Christians kept attending synagogue while recognizing Jesus as the awaited Messiah, forming a blended faith that respected both heritages. They adhered to dietary restrictions, honored the Sabbath, and insisted that male converts be circumcised. The Apocalypse of Peter's focus on ethical conduct matched their interest in living righteously, yet its non-Jewish origins and Greek cultural foundations restricted how much it appealed to their circles. Marcionite congregations completely dismissed the Hebrew Scriptures regarding the God of the Old Testament as a separate being from the compassionate Father that Jesus revealed. They assembled their own collection of sacred texts that included only Luke's Gospel and letters from Paul, which they edited to strip out Jewish elements. The Apocalypse of Peter's explicit portrayals of punishment appeared to echo the severe justice of the Hebrew God they had turned away from, rather than the compassion of the Christian Father they praised. Montanist gatherings anticipated fresh prophecies that would extend the revelations the first apostles had received. They maintained rigorous moral standards and readied themselves for Christ's approaching return to set up his kingdom on earth. The Apocalypse of Peter's prophetic manner and thorough eschatology attracted those who appreciated continued divine messages, though its connection to an ancient apostle clashed with their focus on modern spiritual abilities. Ebionite Christians saw Jesus as a human prophet instead of a divine rescuer, focusing on his position as instructor and model rather than universal savior. They lived in deliberate poverty and shared resources communally while keeping Jewish ceremonial practices. The Apocalypse of Peter's ethical lessons matched their principles, but its supernatural components appeared at odds with their rational understanding of religious reality. Docetic followers claimed that Christ only seemed to possess a physical form, contending that divine spirit could never genuinely merge with tainted matter. They stressed Jesus' celestial beginnings and timeless character while downplaying his earthly existence. The apocalypse of Peter's specific imagery, depicting bodily punishment and rising from death, appeared to oppose their view of reality as essentially spiritual instead of physical. Every Christian group had their own set of holy writings that mirrored specific theological viewpoints and community requirements. Rural congregations cherished uncomplicated moral lessons, while city churches favored complex theological discussions. Wealthy supporters paid for copying texts that reinforced their standing in society, while oppressed minorities kept writings that brought solace during hardship. The path toward establishing the canon involved political and financial elements that bore little connection to spiritual authenticity or apostolic legitimacy. Church leaders who had ties to the empire could advance their chosen texts while pushing alternatives to the margins. Affluent congregations could pay to reproduce and spread their selected scriptures, while communities with fewer resources had to work with whatever manuscripts they managed to acquire. Geographic variations in how Christians practiced their faith created isolated pockets of difference that kept alternative traditions alive well after they had vanished in other places. The apocalypse of Peter held onto areas of acceptance in Egypt and Syria even as it disappeared from recollection in Greece and Italy. These regional distinctions showed local theological tastes and cultural expectations rather than fair assessments of which texts had authority. Discoveries through archaeology keep showing us how varied early Christian beliefs and practices were, in ways that dispute the conventional stories about how Orthodox Christianity took shape. Pieces of papyrus preserve writings once believed to be entirely gone. Meanwhile, inscriptions provide evidence of groups that practiced different rituals and held different theological views than what the surviving written records describe. The elimination of alternative forms of Christianity happened through both deliberate persecution and simple disregard. Church authorities condemned teachings they considered heretical while refusing to reproduce or keep disputed writings. Financial realities strengthened theological decisions as communities put their scarce resources into manuscripts that had official backing instead of those regarded with scholarly doubt. Bringing back these forgotten perspectives demands painstaking detective work using archaeology and literary evidence, assembling incomplete clues from many different sources. The apocalypse of Peter only survived because desert sand protected papyrus pieces that might have otherwise turned to powder. Most alternative Christian writings likely vanished completely without leaving behind any mark in recorded history. Contemporary Christianity could have taken a very different path if political situations had supported other theological movements, or if financial circumstances had kept different collections of texts intact. The apocalypse of Peter's striking moral imagery could have influenced Christian visual art and writing in ways that would appear normal instead of unusual to believers today. Debates about which books belong in the canon might have been settled using different standards that preferred widespread popularity over academic endorsement. The forgotten versions of Christianity show us that religious movements grow through historical developments that involve human decisions rather than unavoidable divine direction. The writings that made it through the canonization process show the tastes and biases of specific groups at particular points in history. The apocalypse of Peter's removal from the biblical canon reveals just as much about Christianity in the 4th century as it does about the text on its own. The winter of 1886 delivered more than just cold weather to French archaeologist Urbain Bourriant at his dig location near Akhmim, Egypt. Within a tomb that had shielded what it held from hundreds of years of desert windstorms, his crew found a leather-bound codex filled with writings that scholars had considered permanently lost. Hidden among these ancient finds were portions of the Apocalypse of Peter, ready to startle the contemporary world, with images that had both frightened and motivated believers 1,500 years before. Bourriant's first review of the manuscript showed Greek writing that felt both recognizable and astonishing. The document asserted apostolic credentials while portraying scenes of divine retribution that went beyond anything in the recognized biblical canon. Initial translations made their way through European academic circles where researchers reacted with combinations of interest and disgust to portrayals they had previously known only through indirect mentions in old church records. The scholarly community of the late 1800s had limited familiarity with Christian writings outside the canon. Academics had concentrated mainly on creating dependable versions of biblical books instead of investigating the wider range of early Christian composition. Finding the Apocalypse of Peter provided glimpses into a religious world that appeared both more intricate and more troubling than conventional histories had indicated. Protestant academics encountered an uncomfortable situation when dealing with this newly found document. Their tradition stressed biblical authority while turning away from later additions to the apostolic witness. The Apocalypse of Peter claimed ancient origins while holding material that appeared to challenge their grasp of Christian instruction. This conflict raised difficult questions regarding how decisions about the canon had been reached and whether those decisions could be reconsidered. Catholic scholars came to the discovery carrying different assumptions, yet facing comparable doubt. Their tradition recognized the power of church councils and papal rulings in setting canonical limits. The Apocalypse of Peter had been clearly turned down by early church officials, which made what it contained historically noteworthy, but theologically beside the point. Even so, the text's powerful imagery and moral themes connected with Catholic customs of art and worship in ways that made straightforward rejection complicated. German higher criticism had equipped certain scholars to anticipate variety and growth in early Christian writings. These investigators treated the Apocalypse of Peter as important proof for grasping how Christian groups had understood Jesus' message in various historical settings. They focused on historical examination over theological assessment, viewing the text as a view into ancient religious thinking instead of a possible foundation for modern spiritual authority. How the public responded to news coverage of the discovery showed widespread interest in apocalyptic subjects that respectable Christianity had attempted to reduce or interpret symbolically. Newspaper stories about Peter's visions drew readers eager for specific information about what happens after death, topics their clergy usually sidestepped. The text's visual language appeared to fulfill curiosity regarding ultimate matters that contemporary theology had intentionally left unclear. Scholars studying comparative religion discovered in the Apocalypse of Peter support for ideas about how religious concepts evolved across various cultures and time periods. They observed similarities between Peter's depictions of punishment and comparable subjects in Egyptian, Persian, and Greek customs. These links implied that Christian apocalyptic writing had taken from older traditions while reshaping their substance for fresh theological aims. Historians of art identified visual patterns in medieval Christian artwork that appeared to mirror portrayals discovered in the recently found text. Cathedral carvings and illustrated manuscripts held elements that resembled the Apocalypse of Peter's imagery more accurately than anything found in the accepted Bible. This finding indicated that the ancient writing had shaped Christian artistic custom even following its removal from authorized scripture. Psychological readings of the text stressed how it revealed human worries about moral mistakes and divine judgment that went beyond specific historical eras. Sigmund Freud and other founders of depth psychology observed in Peter's visions proof of hidden fears and wants that influenced religious expression throughout cultures. The text's attraction appeared to stem from universal psychological requirements instead of particularly Christian theological interests. Literary scholars positioned the Apocalypse of Peter within the wider custom of visionary writing that encompassed Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost. They marked how ancient Christian writers had employed comparable methods of moral teaching through striking imagery that contemporary authors kept using for different goals. The writing appeared to stand for a significant connection in how Western literary custom developed. Archaeological finds in Egypt kept producing more fragments and intact manuscripts that broadened scholarly comprehension of early Christian variety. The Nag Hammadi Library, uncovered in 1945, held numerous texts that had been missing for more than 1,000 years. These discoveries generated fresh respect for how complex ancient Christianity was while raising concerns about which perspectives had been silenced during the formation of the canon. Feminist researchers discovered in writings like The Apocalypse of Peter proof of women's involvement in early Christian groups that later mainstream Christianity had reduced or wiped out. Although the text itself showed the patriarchal thinking typical of its era, the simple reality of its survival pointed to networks of believers that included women serving as teachers, copiers, and spiritual leaders. Digital humanities initiatives have brought the Apocalypse of Peter within reach of worldwide audiences in ways that earlier generations of scholars could never have imagined. Online collections offer numerous translations, while hyperlinked notes link the text to associated materials and current research. These technological developments have made ancient Christian writings available to everyone, while opening up fresh opportunities for comparing and analyzing them. The rediscovery of the Apocalypse of Peter keeps sparking scholarly discussion regarding the limits of early Christianity and the standards employed for deciding canonical authority. Certain researchers advocate for broad methods that appreciate variety and historical chance, while others insist that theological merit and apostolic genuineness supply essential benchmarks for separating authentic traditions from fake ones. Fear holds a strange capacity to direct the human mind toward ultimate concerns that wealth and ease let us ignore. The early Christians who valued the Apocalypse of Peter existed in a world where death came without notice and fairness appeared constantly postponed. Their attraction to thorough portrayals of divine retribution showed psychological requirements that went beyond simple morbid interest or primitive belief in superstitions. Terror functioned as an instructor in ways that gentle teaching could never equal. A trader considering dishonest scales might dismiss abstract instruction about integrity, but graphic images of swindlers suspended by their tongues above fiery lakes formed memories that would emerge during critical moments of ethical choice. The Apocalypse of Peter grasped that moral conduct frequently relies more on mental pictures than logical thinking. Ancient thinking worked within systems of honor and disgrace that made public embarrassment appear more severe than personal pain. The text's focus on being revealed and identified in the next life attracted believers who viewed reputation as more precious than existence itself. The possibility of everlasting disgrace before both divine and human observers supplied motivation that exceeded dread of bodily suffering by itself. Guilt needed tangible form to become mentally bearable for people who did not have contemporary therapeutic language. The Apocalypse of Peter presented particular punishments that aligned with specific wrongdoings in ways that let believers picture their own moral shortcomings and contemplate fitting results. This matching of offense and consequence brought psychological comfort through the assurance that fairness would finally win. Social regulation worked through fear more successfully than through positive rewards in groups where resources stayed limited and rivalry fierce. The text's extensive list of punishments aided community authorities who required methods for keeping control and order. Warnings of everlasting outcomes held influence that short-term penalties could never achieve, particularly among believers who anticipated Christ's return during their own lives. Childhood encounters with punishment and approval formed psychological habits that made adult believers open to comparable structures in religious settings. The Apocalypse of Peter addressed people who had absorbed moral instruction through physical correction and social criticism. Its imagery connected with recollections of parental control and group assessment that influenced their grasp of divine rule. Injury from persecution and being pushed to society's edges generated psychological damage that demanded both explanation and reassurance. The text's assurance that present victims would see their oppressors punished brought emotional restoration for believers who found it hard to keep their faith while facing continuous difficulty. Images of divine fairness presented hope that current situations did not show final reality or lasting states. Forming group identity gained from shared terrors that separated members from non-members while building unity among those in the community. The Apocalypse of Peter supplied shared vocabulary and imagery that permitted believers to identify one another while keeping barriers against dangerous outside forces. Shared dread turned into a basis for connection instead of separation. Psychological displacement let believers transfer personal worries onto outside opponents while keeping favorable views of themselves. The text's judgment of particular wrongdoings allowed those reading to link themselves with the righteous while seeing their adversaries as headed for punishment. This process shielded vulnerable egos while strengthening community dedication and doctrinal allegiance. Cleansing ceremonies acquired significance through dread of spiritual pollution that the text portrayed in explicit detail. Believers who might otherwise consider baptism, periods of fasting, or confession as meaningless rituals discovered deeper importance when they grasped these actions as shields against everlasting outcomes. Fear changed ordinary religious activities into urgent requirements for spiritual preservation. Conversion moments frequently include sharp transitions from terror to comfort, as potential believers shifted from seeing themselves among the condemned to having certainty of rescue. The Apocalypse of Peter supplied before and after stories that assisted converts in grasping their spiritual change in concrete language. The text's imagery provided emotional substance to abstract theological ideas regarding justification and being saved. Techniques for remembering in cultures that spoke rather than wrote depended greatly on emotional links to keep vital knowledge alive across generations. The text's disturbing portrayals generated lasting mental pictures that passed along moral instruction more successfully than organized ethical teaching. Fear turned into an educational instrument that supported groups without widespread reading ability or established schools. Dreams and prophetic experiences regularly included pieces from religious writings that believers had committed to memory or listened to many times. The Apocalypse of Peter's striking imagery showed up in individual spiritual encounters that appeared to validate the text's power and importance. These mental occurrences formed recurring patterns that strengthened faith in the text's divine source and prophetic correctness. Annual patterns of worry and festivity found voice through religious activities that focused on either judgment or compassion, depending on where they fell in the church year. The text offered suitable readings for times of repentance when groups concentrated on moral reflection and spiritual training. Fear operated as readiness for happiness instead of a goal by itself within these intentionally organized religious schedules. Mental disturbance in ancient settings frequently showed itself through religious words and pictures that mirrored the person's cultural surroundings and spiritual worries. The Apocalypse of Peter's portrayals of punishment might have shaped how certain believers went through and communicated psychological pain. Groups that highlighted divine judgment could have accidentally made worse rather than eased emotional suffering among those who were vulnerable. Power systems within Christian groups obtained credibility through connection with divine judgment that the text portrayed in gripping detail. Authorities who asserted apostolic heritage or prophetic abilities could reference Peter's visions as proof of their spiritual power. Dread of everlasting punishment made believers more ready to receive human direction and yield to institutional control. Healing purposes of religious fear worked through managed contact with images that caused worry within encouraging group settings. The text permitted believers to face their deepest terrors regarding death and judgment while encircled by fellow believers who held comparable worries. This group handling of existential worry brought psychological advantages that thinking alone could not accomplish. Mental conflict between actual experience and religious assurances generated internal pressure that needed psychological settlement. When believers endured hardship while their opponents thrived, the Apocalypse of Peter presented reasons that kept faith alive by moving justice into future time. This time-based shifting let groups hold on to hope, even when facts appeared to oppose divine care. The magnificent Cathedral of Autun emerged from French ground in the 12th century. Its stones were shaped with pictures that would have pleased the writer of the Apocalypse of Peter. Over the primary doorway, Giselbertus carved a final judgment tableau where the damned twisted in agonies strikingly close to those portrayed in the ancient writing. Demons pulled wrongdoers toward the gaping jaws of hell, while angels measured souls with divine exactness. The medieval craftsman had never encountered Peter's visions, yet his tools appeared directed by the same moral creativity that had formed the ancient apocalypse. Gothic cathedrals throughout Europe transformed into exhibitions of hellish instruction, where Peter's impact murmured through rock and colored glass. Chartres, Notre Dame, Amiens. Each grand building added visual components that mirrored the text's methodical treatment of divine retribution. Rich sponsors funded these enormous undertakings partly to teach believers who could not read about moral results that spoken words alone could not transmit successfully. Decorated manuscripts kept Peter's imagery in more personal environments, where individual readers could examine thorough representations of punishment and salvation. Books of Hours held tiny paintings that carried the text's visions into private worship activities. Noble households valued these artistic possessions that merged spiritual teaching with beautiful appeal, turning moral instruction both lovely and easy to recall. Mystery plays changed Peter's still portrayals into active theatrical displays that involved audiences through several senses at once. Performers dressed as demons employed mechanical contraptions to replicate the punishments outlined in ancient apocalyptic writings. These shows turned abstract theological ideas immediate and engaging, while keeping conventional moral lessons for people who could not read. Dante's Divine Comedy stands for the most refined artistic reshaping of subjects that started in writings like the Apocalypse of Peter. The Italian writer built a systematic map of what comes after death that exceeded ancient visions in both written excellence and theological sophistication. Still, hints of Peter's impact show throughout the Inferno's thoughtfully arranged punishments that connect particular wrongdoings with suitable results. Renaissance craftsmen kept drawing ideas from apocalyptic imagery while fitting conventional subjects for fresh artistic tastes. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel painting merged classical artistic methods with Christian moral teaching that would have seemed recognizable to those familiar with the Apocalypse of Peter. The artist's commanding figures represented spiritual realities and visual shapes that rose above specific historical moments or cultural backgrounds. The Protestant Reformation generated fresh conflicts around religious artwork that had customarily featured apocalyptic subjects. Reformed congregations turned away from complex visual displays as likely causes of idol worship, while keeping belief in divine judgment and everlasting punishment. This theological change decreased artistic representation of subjects that the Apocalypse of Peter had assisted in planting in Christian thinking. Baroque creators like Hieronymus Bosch drove apocalyptic imagery to fresh heights of imagination and terror that surpassed even the Apocalypse of Peter's visual portrayals. The Garden of Earthly Delights and comparable pieces generated dreamlike settings of wrongdoing and retribution that showed both conventional Christian subjects and personal artistic perspective. These masterworks proved the lasting attraction of moral teaching through startling visual imagery. Written works kept reshaping apocalyptic subjects for fresh audiences and aims throughout the modern era. John Milton's Paradise Lost, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and numerous other pieces pulled from customs that reached back to ancient writings like the Apocalypse of Peter. These writers transformed basic moral teaching into refined artistic statement while keeping fundamental pieces of the initial vision. Popular customs kept apocalyptic imagery through spoken tales, melodies, and practices that carried moral instruction across generations without structured written education. Country groups maintained views about divine judgment and everlasting punishment that showed ancient worries even when they did not have straight connection to the writings that had originally expressed these thoughts. Group memory kept core components while changing surface features to match local settings. Movies found in apocalyptic subjects abundant material for visual narrative that could connect with huge audiences with remarkable success. Pictures like The Seventh Seal, The Exorcist, and numerous others pulled from religious customs that held impact from writings like the Apocalypse of Peter. These contemporary works employed advanced technical abilities to generate images that went beyond ancient imaginations, while fulfilling comparable purposes of moral teaching and emotional release. Online platforms have opened fresh ways of encountering apocalyptic imagery through participatory games, virtual reality, and digital groups that investigate subjects of judgment and salvation. These technological advances permit today's audiences to go through moral decisions and their results in ways that would have astonished ancient believers who depended on fixed writings and spoken teaching. Horror writing discovered in apocalyptic customs abundant supplies of imagery and mental understanding that could frighten contemporary readers while investigating basic concerns about human character and moral duty. Writers like Clive Barker, Stephen King, and others built pieces that brought ancient worries about divine judgment forward for today's audiences, who could dismiss conventional religious structures while staying fascinated by matters of final fairness. Illustrated novels and comic publications reshaped apocalyptic subjects for visual narrative that merged written story with artistic statement. These widely consumed media shapes connected with audiences that could never meet conventional religious writings while keeping fundamental pieces of moral teaching through engaging and reachable displays. Modern art displays have added apocalyptic imagery to comment on current social and political matters while pulling from conventional religious symbolism that reaches back to ancient writings. Creative people employ recognizable visual vocabularies to share fresh messages about environmental harm, social unfairness, and other today's worries that appear to demand prophetic alert and moral assessment. Musical works throughout different styles have kept pulling inspiration from apocalyptic subjects that started in writings like The Apocalypse of Peter. From medieval chants to contemporary metal, composers have discovered in these ancient visions material for artistic statement that connects with universal human worries about fairness, retribution, and salvation. The text's impact resonates through hundreds of years of musical growth in ways that prove its lasting psychological and spiritual importance. The ancient papyrus deteriorates at its borders, its Greek characters disappearing into the desert sand from which contemporary archaeologists saved it more than 100 years back. Still, something within the Apocalypse of Peter will not fade away. In university collections and online archives, behind secured entrances of uncommon book rooms and visible in ordinary view on web servers, Peter's visions keep sharing their troubling realities to anyone courageous enough to pay attention. We prefer to believe we have progressed past such basic terrors, that our advanced grasp of psychology and theology has released us from rough images of divine retribution. Our congregations discuss love instead of anger, counseling instead of judgment, restoration instead of blame. We have tamed God, rendered the divine acceptable for suburban tastes and business vision declarations. However, deep in the night, when rest escapes us and moral awareness awakens, Peter's old terrors still hold capacity to unsettle our carefully built calm. The writing endures because it addresses something more profound than theological refinement or cultural polish. It speaks to the human appetite for fairness that no quantity of explaining away can entirely fulfill. We observe wrongdoing flourish and blameless people endure, then convince ourselves that moral results are simply social inventions or evolutionary modifications. However, Peter's visions demand that the cosmos possesses a moral foundation that will finally make itself known regardless of all surface indications otherwise. Contemporary horror writing, from the refined psychological dread of Shirley Jackson to the visual brutality of today's movies, pulls from the same source of worry that fed the Apocalypse of Peter. Our amusement sector has constructed whole categories around the idea that moral breaches demand punishment, that fairness will, in the end, win, that evil people cannot dodge results indefinitely. We have removed religion from Peter's vision, while keeping its core framework and emotional draw. Ecological harm and climate alteration have built fresh settings for apocalyptic reasoning that render ancient writings appear nearly predictive. The Apocalypse of Peter's alerts about divine judgment discover parallels in today's forecasts about worldwide disaster coming from human moral breakdown. We confront the chance that our species' ethical decisions could settle our continuation, providing fresh importance to ancient worries about final results. Online platforms have built digital areas where moral assessment works with the quick certainty that Peter's visions guaranteed. Web groups spot violators, gather shared punishment, and generate reputation results that can ruin lives with outstanding speed. The web has spread the authority of moral enforcement while removing the compassion and pardon that conventional religious structures usually placed alongside their alerts about judgment. Mental research keeps showing the ways that people demand moral structures to keep mental wellness and social teamwork. We appear to require views about fairness and results to work successfully in gatherings and discover significance in personal life. The Apocalypse of Peter grasped this requirement well before behavioral study could clarify its evolutionary beginnings or brain processes. Political drives throughout the ideological range consistently use apocalyptic words that mirror subjects from ancient writings like the Apocalypse of Peter. Both progressive and traditional voices alert about moral breakdown causing social breakdown, spot particular wrongdoings that endanger group continuation, and assure that fairness will finally win over present unfairness. The text's speaking strategies keep forming public talk in ways that most speakers and hearers never identify. Healing methods for guilt and disgrace frequently find it hard to supply the mental settlement that more basic systems of moral responsibility appeared to present. Today's counseling highlights self-reception and pardon, while occasionally leaving people with unsettled emotions about their own moral mistakes. The Apocalypse of Peter's sharp divisions and final results brought mental completion that contemporary healing methods could not totally substitute. Religious groups keep struggling with matters about divine fairness and human responsibility that the Apocalypse of Peter handled with troubling straightforwardness. Progressive denominations highlight God's love while finding it hard to keep moral guidelines, while traditional groups keep conventional words about judgment while fitting to today's tastes. The writing stands as a signal of Christianity's more challenging, earlier forms that will not divide compassion from fairness or love from moral result. Archaeological finds keep showing fresh pieces and connected writings that widen our grasp of early Christian variety while bringing up concerns about which perspectives were kept and which were quieted. The Apocalypse of Peter stands for thousands of comparable pieces that vanished when specific theological movements obtained institutional control. We can solely picture what other viewpoints were missing when the early congregation reached its canonical choices. Digital humanities undertakings have brought ancient writings available to worldwide audiences while building fresh chances for comparing and understanding. Anyone with web connection can currently encounter the Apocalypse of Peter and shape their own assessments about its worth and importance. This spreading of scholarly materials has altered the setting of religious power while providing fresh vitality to overlooked writings. The restricted entrance that 19th century archaeologists opened in the Egyptian desert cannot be totally shut once more. Peter's visions have joined today's awareness through several paths that guarantee their keeping regardless of authorized religious backing or scholarly agreement. The writing has turned into part of our group identity, shaping artwork, writing, psychology, and spirituality in ways that rise above any specific theological structure. Maybe the Apocalypse of Peter's biggest contribution to contemporary readers rests not in its particular moral directions or theological assertions, but in how it signals that people have constantly struggled with concerns about fairness, significance, and final responsibility. The writing makes us deal with our own beliefs about moral results while pushing us to express superior options if we discover its responses insufficient. The ancient papyrus keeps deteriorating, but the concerns it brings up stay as pressing today as they were 1700 years back. We could have altered our words and sharpened our divisions. However, we have not left behind the human requirement to trust that our decisions hold weight, that fairness will finally win, and that the cosmos possesses a moral foundation that provides significance to our battles between righteousness and wrongdoing. In this manner, the restricted entrance that the Apocalypse of Peter opened will stay open as long as people keep asking whether anything we accomplish genuinely holds significance in the end.